In the realm of role-playing games, there are stories that burrow deep into the imagination, planting seeds that bloom long after the final credits roll. Final Fantasy V stands as one such tale, a narrative woven from threads of ancient evil, crystalline power, and the enduring strength found in bonds forged through shared adversity. Released in 1992 for the Super Nintendo, or Super Famicom in Japan, this game arrived at a pivotal moment in the series' evolution, standing between the narrative complexity of its predecessor and successor, while carving its own distinct path through fantasy realms that span dimensions and generations. The story begins not with heroes or villains, but with history itself. To understand the world of Final Fantasy V, one must first look backward through the mists of time to an age when magic flowed like water and ambition knew no bounds. 1,000 years before the events that would draw four unlikely companions together, the world existed as a single unified realm, whole and unbroken. In that ancient age, there lived a sorcerer whose name would echo through the centuries as a warning and a curse. Enwo was his name, and power was his obsession. Enwo possessed immortality, a gift that should have granted him the luxury of patience, the wisdom to observe the slow turning of ages and learn from the accumulated knowledge of endless years. But immortality without purpose is a hollow thing, and Enwo's purpose grew twisted with each passing century. He gazed upon the world and saw only a stage for his own glorification, a realm waiting to be shaped according to his vision. The power he possessed, considerable though it was, proved insufficient for his ambitions. So Enwo made a choice that would reshape reality itself. He traded his immortality, that most precious of gifts, for something darker and more terrible. He claimed dominion over the void. The void was not merely an absence or an emptiness. It was annihilation given form, nothingness that hungered to consume all of existence. Where it touched, reality itself unraveled. Mountains crumbled to dust, and then to less than dust, to absolute non-existence. Rivers evaporated not into vapor, but into pure negation. Living beings caught in its reach did not die so much as cease to have ever been, erased from the fabric of the world as though they had never drawn breath. With this terrible power at his command, Enwo set about remaking the world according to his dark vision. The devastation was beyond comprehension. Entire kingdoms vanished overnight, their cities and citizens consumed by the hungry void. Forests that had stood for millennia were reduced to barren wastes where nothing remained, not even the memory of what had been. Oceans boiled away into nothingness, leaving behind chasms that stretched down into absolute emptiness. The sky itself seemed to tear at Enwo's command, revealing glimpses of the void beyond reality's thin veil. The world screamed in agony as piece by piece it was fed to the insatiable hunger of non-existence. But the people of that ancient age were not without their own strength. As Enwo's campaign of destruction swept across the land, warriors rose to oppose him. 12 individuals, whose names have been lost to the erosion of time, but whose deeds remained enshrined in legend, came together in desperate alliance. They knew they could not match Enwo's power directly, could not hope to overcome the void through strength of arms or magic alone. Instead, they sought out weapons, legendary armaments scattered across the dying world, each one crafted with ancient techniques and imbued with power that resonated on a fundamental level with the structure of reality itself. These 12 legendary weapons varied in form and function. Some were blades that could cut through the very fabric of the void. Others were staves that channeled elemental forces with unprecedented purity, and still others were implements of war that had been wielded by heroes of ages past. Together, these weapons represented more than mere physical might. They were symbols of resistance, proof that even in the face of absolute annihilation, the will to survive could manifest in tangible form. The 12 warriors who bore these weapons knew they marched toward almost certain death, but they marched nonetheless, driven by the understanding that failure meant the end not just of themselves, but of everything. The battle between the 12 warriors and Enuo raged across what remained of the world. Mountains shook with the force of their conflict. The sky blazed with energies that mortal eyes had never witnessed and would likely never see again. Enuo wielded the void like an artist with a brush, painting swathes of non-existence across reality's canvas, while the warriors countered with weapons that burned with the concentrated essence of existence itself. The clash of these opposing forces created paradoxes and impossibilities, moments where cause preceded effect, where the present rewrote the past, where the fundamental laws that governed reality bent and nearly shattered under the strain. In the end, through sacrifice and determination, the 12 warriors prevailed. Enuo fell, his physical form destroyed by the combined might of the legendary weapons. But victory came with a terrible realization. The void itself could not be destroyed. It was not a thing that could be killed or banished or sealed away through conventional means. It simply was, an eternal hunger that existed beyond concepts of life and death. The warriors had defeated Enuo, but the void remained, hovering at the edges of reality, waiting for another opportunity to consume all of existence. In desperation, the survivors of that ancient cataclysm turned to the world's most fundamental source of power. 4 elemental crystals existed, manifestations of the primal forces that held reality together. The crystal of wind, which governed the air and breath itself. The crystal of water, which controlled the flow of rivers and oceans and the blood in living veins. The crystal of fire, which embodied not just flame but the spark of life and the heat of passion. And the crystal of earth, which represented not merely soil and stone but stability and endurance and the foundation upon which all else rested. These crystals possess power beyond mortal comprehension, power that had shaped the world since its first moment of existence. The ancient peoples called upon this power in an act of unprecedented magical engineering. They split each crystal in 2, creating 8 crystals where once there had been 4. This division of power came with a catastrophic consequence. The world itself split along with the crystals, reality fragmenting into 2 distinct but parallel dimensions, each possessing its own set of 4 elemental crystals. The split created an interdimensional rift between the 2 worlds, a space that existed between but belonged to neither. Into this rift, the survivors sealed the void, trapping it in a prison of folded reality where it could threaten neither world. The legendary weapons, their purpose fulfilled, were sealed away in a hidden location, safeguarded against a future that might once again require their use. The knowledge of how to access these weapons was inscribed in a tome. But this book too was split when the worlds divided, its pages scattered between dimensions, ensuring that only in the direst circumstances could the weapons be reclaimed. Centuries passed. The memory of Enuo and the Void faded from active history into legend, and from legend into myth, and from myth into stories told to children who only half believed them. The 2 worlds developed separately, each following its own path of civilization and culture. In the world that would come to be known as Galuf's world, or the Second World, kingdoms rose and fell, Heroes lived and died, and magic slowly faded from common use as the age of myths gave way to an age of reason and technology. But in the forests of this second world, in a place called the Great Forest of Moor, something dark was stirring. For centuries, perhaps since the time of the world splitting, the people of this region had used a particular tree as a prison. When demons manifested, when evil spirits took form, when malevolent entities threatened the innocent, they were sealed within this tree. Generation after generation, the tree absorbed evil, containing it within its bark and roots, preventing these dark forces from wreaking havoc upon the world. The tree became a living prison, its very existence dependent on containing the accumulated malevolence of centuries. 30 years before the main events of our story, the inevitable occurred. The tree, gorged on evil, saturated with malice, could contain no more. The accumulated darkness achieved a critical mass, a concentration of malevolence so intense that it developed consciousness. The evil sealed within the tree did not merely escape. It merged, combining into a singular entity that possessed both terrible power and terrible purpose. The tree itself transformed, taking on a humanoid form, armored and terrible, wreathed in darkness that seemed to drink in light. This new being chose a name that would come to be spoken in whispers of fear: Exdeath. Exdeath emerged from the Moor forest with one driving ambition. He sought the power of the void that had been sealed away when the world split. He understood, perhaps through some inherited memory from the evil spirits that composed his being, that reuniting the two worlds would break the seal on the interdimensional rift and grant access to the void's terrible power. With that power, he could reshape reality according to his will, could reduce the world to nothingness and rebuild it in his own image. But to reunite the worlds, he would first need to shatter the crystals that maintained the split. Before Exdeath could begin his campaign of destruction, he was opposed by 4 warriors who would come to be known as the Dawn Warriors. These 4 individuals, drawn from different corners of the second world, recognized the threat Exdeath posed and united to stop him. There was Galuf Baldision, a warrior of uncommon strength and determination, whose jovial exterior concealed a tactical mind and unshakable resolve. Beside him stood Dorgan Klauser, a swordsman of exceptional skill, quiet and contemplative, who fought not for glory, but from a deep sense of responsibility to protect those who could not protect themselves. The third warrior was Szezat Matthias Serget, known as Zezat of Ice for his cool demeanor under pressure and his mastery of coal-based magic and tactics. He possessed the mind of a strategist and the heart of a leader, commanding respect through deed rather than word. The final member of this quartet was perhaps the most unusual. Kelga Vlondet was not human, but a werewolf, leader of his people, combining lupine instincts with warrior discipline. His fighting style was unique, incorporating techniques that only his physiology could perform, and he possessed loyalty that ran deeper than mere alliance, a bond of brotherhood with his fellow Dawn warriors that transcended species. These 4 warriors confronted Exdeath in a battle that shook the second world. They fought through his forces, penetrated his defenses, and engaged the Dark Sorcerer directly. The conflict was fierce beyond description, magic and steel clashing in combinations that created new forms of destruction with each exchange. But despite their skill and determination, despite fighting with every technique they had mastered and every ounce of strength they possessed, the Dawn warriors discovered a terrible truth. They could not kill Exdeath. The Dark Sorcerer's nature as an amalgamation of evil spirits granted him a form of immortality, different from conventional life. Destroying his physical body would only release the spirits to reform elsewhere, to coalesce once more into the entity known as Exdeath. The Dawn Warriors could defeat him in battle, but could not eliminate him permanently. Faced with this impossible situation, they chose the only option available. They pursued Exdeath through a dimensional gate to the first world, Bartz's world, and there they performed a sealing ritual using the power of that world's 4 crystals. The ritual succeeded, but it came with complications. Dorgan objected strenuously to leaving a monster from their world, sealed away in another dimension, in a world inhabited by innocent people who had no knowledge of Exdeath's nature or the danger he represented. It seemed wrong, even cowardly, to seal away their problem and abandon it for another world to deal with should the seal ever break. But the other Dawn Warriors pointed out the painful reality. They had no better option. They could not destroy Exdeath, and they could not safely contain him in their own world without risking his eventual escape and the destruction he would wreak. After much debate, they reached a compromise. Exdeath would be sealed in the first world, using the power of its 4 crystals, ensuring that as long as those crystals remained intact, the seal would hold. But Dorgan would remain behind in the first world as a guardian, a watcher who would monitor the seal and ensure it remained strong. If Exdeath ever showed signs of breaking free, Dorgan would be there to sound the alarm and fight to prevent catastrophe. It was a lonely duty, an exile from his home world and companions, but Dorgan accepted it without hesitation, driven by the sense of responsibility that had always defined his character. The other 3 Dawn Warriors returned to their own world, where they were hailed as heroes who had saved civilization from extinction. Galuf took up his responsibilities as king of Baal, ruling his people with wisdom and humor in equal measure. Sezat assumed control of the kingdom of Surgut, building a fleet and training soldiers against the possibility of future threats. Kelger returned to his people in Quelb, leading his werewolf clan and maintaining their traditions while keeping watch for any sign of Exdeath's return. They lived their lives, raised families, and grew old, but they never forgot their fallen enemy or the friend who remained behind to guard against his return. In the first world, Dorgan settled in a small town called Lix, maintaining his vigil over the seal while trying to build something approaching a normal life. He met a woman named Stella, fell in love despite the weight of his secret mission, and married her. Together they had a son, whom they named Bartz. Dorgan tried to be a good father, but his duty constantly called him away. He traveled the world, ostensibly as an adventurer seeking glory and treasure, but in reality checking on the seal, monitoring the 4 crystals, ensuring that Exdeath remained contained. He taught his son what he could, including some of the martial techniques he had learned during his time as a Dawn Warrior. But he never explained the full truth of his past or his purpose. Tragedy visited the Klauser family when Bartz was still young. Stella fell ill, and sickness that the healers could not cure. And despite Dorgan's desperate searches for remedies and his willingness to travel to the ends of the world for anything that might save her, she succumbed to her illness. The loss devastated both father and son. Dorgan threw himself even more intensely into his wandering, taking young Bartz with him, teaching him to survive in the wilderness, to ride the large flightless birds called chocobos, to appreciate the beauty and danger of the world in equal measure. 3 years before the beginning of our story, Dorgan himself fell ill. Unlike Stella's mysterious affliction, his sickness was simply the accumulated wear of a lifetime of combat and travel, the inevitable breakdown of a body pushed beyond its limits too many times. he returned to Lix to die, and with his last breaths, he made Bart's promise to travel the world, to see everything, to live free from the burdens that had defined Dorgan's life. He did not speak of Exdeath or the seal or his true purpose. He died keeping his secrets, believing perhaps that the seal would hold indefinitely and that Bartz deserved a life unburdened by ancient conflicts and terrible responsibilities. Bartz honored his father's dying wish. At 20 years old, he became a wanderer, traveling with his chocobo companion Boko, taking odd jobs when necessary but mostly living free, sleeping under the stars, fishing in rivers, exploring ruins and mountains simply because they were there. He had no grand ambitions, no desire for fame or fortune, no burning purpose. He lived each day as it came, finding contentment in the journey itself rather than any particular destination. It was a simple life, some might say a shallow one, but it was the life his father had wanted for him, and Bartz embraced it fully. The world, however, had other plans. The peace that had lasted for 30 years was beginning to fracture. In both worlds, people had grown dependent on the crystals for more than just maintaining the dimensional seal. Clever engineers and ambitious rulers had discovered ways to tap into the crystal's power, to siphon off small amounts of their energy for practical purposes. A man named Sid Previa, a brilliant engineer in the First World, had pioneered the creation of crystal amplifiers, machines that could harness the crystal's power to provide energy for cities, to power ships and factories, to bring comfort and convenience to millions of people. The intentions were good, the benefits undeniable, but the effect was catastrophic. The crystals were not infinite sources of power. Each time energy was drawn from them, they weakened slightly. The amplifiers, used continuously across both worlds, drained the crystals at an unprecedented rate. What had taken only minimal effort to maintain for centuries now required constant output to satisfy the demands of civilizations that had grown dependent on crystal power. The crystals began to fail, their strength diminishing, the barriers they maintained starting to crack. And in his sealed prison, Exdeath felt the weakening. He could not yet break free directly, but he could extend his influence through the cracks appearing in his containment. He could touch minds, plant suggestions, manipulate those who came near the crystals. In the second world, he began reaching out, preparing the groundwork for his return. In the first world, where he was physically sealed, he prepared for the moment when the crystals would fail entirely and release him back into a world that had forgotten he existed. The stage was set. Ancient evil stirred in darkness, preparing for resurrection. Crystals that had maintained reality structure for a millennium approached their breaking point, and in a small tent by a forest stream, a young man named Bartz Klauser slept peacefully beside his chocobo companion, completely unaware that his simple life of wandering was about to end forever, that destiny was about to crash down from the sky in the form of a meteor, and that the son of a dawn warrior would be called upon to finish his father's unfinished mission. The wind had stopped. This simple fact, noticed by farmers and sailors and anyone whose livelihood depended on understanding weather patterns, was the first sign that something fundamental had changed. Wind was not supposed to simply stop. Air had to move, had to circulate, driven by differences in temperature and pressure. A world without wind was a dying world, and those who understood this felt the first stirrings of fear. In the kingdom of Tycoon, a realm in the northern regions of the First World, King Alexander Highwind Tycoon felt this fear more keenly than most. His kingdom was named for the Windrake, a near-extinct species of flying dragon, and his family had always maintained a special connection to the wind itself. King Tycoon decided he could not ignore this omen. He mounted his kingdom's Windrake, the last of its kind in the First World, and flew toward the Wind Shrine, the temple that housed the Wind Crystal. He left behind 2 daughters. The elder, named Sarissa, had been lost at sea when she was a child, swept away in a storm and presumed dead, though her body was never recovered. The younger daughter, Lenna Charlotte Tycoon, watched her father depart with growing concern. When hours passed and he did not return, when the wind remained still and dead, Lenna made a decision. She would follow her father to the Wind Shrine and discover what had happened. That same night, as Lenna prepared for her journey, the sky above the world blazed with unexpected light. A meteor, massive and burning, streaked across the darkness and crashed to Earth with an impact that shook the ground for miles around. This was no natural phenomenon. Meteors of this size did not simply appear, and their trajectories did not naturally bend toward planetary surfaces with such precision. This meteor had been sent, launched through the void between dimensions as a desperate message, though what that message contained would not become clear until much later. Bartz felt the impact in his bones despite being miles from the crash site. He and Boko were camped near Tycoon when the meteor fell, and Bartz's first instinct was simple curiosity. He was a wanderer, after all, driven by the desire to see interesting things, and a meteor crash certainly qualified as interesting. He and Boko made their way toward the impact crater, navigating through the forest in darkness, following the faint glow that still emanated from superheated rock. Near the meteor, Bartz encountered a young woman being attacked by goblins. She wore the traveling clothes of nobility, though they were dusty and torn from her journey. She fought back against her attackers with more courage than skill, clearly not trained for combat, but refusing to surrender without a fight. Bartz did not hesitate. He drew his sword. Boko charged forward with a fighting screech, and together they drove off the goblin pack. The woman introduced herself as Lenna, though she did not initially reveal her royal status, and she explained that she was traveling to the Wind Shrine to find her father. Before they could part ways, the meteor itself began to shift. The crash had not killed its passenger, but merely delivered him to his destination. An old man emerged from the crater, staggering and disoriented, clearly injured from the rough landing. He looked around with confusion, unable to remember anything except his name. Galuf, he called himself, though everything else, his home, his purpose, the reason he had crossed between dimensions in a meteor, all of it was gone, erased by the impact and the journey. He knew only that he needed to reach the Wind Shrine, that something terrible was happening there, though he could not explain how he knew this or why it mattered. Lenna decided that she and Galuf would travel together to the Wind Shrine. Bartz, being asked for nothing and feeling no particular obligation, prepared to continue his own wandering. But Boko had other ideas. The chocobo, normally content to follow wherever Bartz led, refused to move. When Bartz tried to climb into the saddle, Boko bucked him off. When Bartz tried to walk away on foot, Boko blocked his path, pecking at him with a beak that could break bones if applied with real force. The message was clear. They were going to help these people, whether Bartz wanted to or not. Bartz, faced with his chocobo's inexplicable but unshakable conviction, finally relented. He told himself this was just a temporary diversion, that he would escort Lenna and Galuf to the Wind Shrine, and then return to his wandering. He did not think about his father, did not remember the stories Dorgan had sometimes told about ancient evils and sacred duties. He was just a traveler helping some people in need. Nothing more complicated than that. The fact that this decision would irrevocably change his life would draw him into conflicts that spanned dimensions and pit him against an evil that had nearly destroyed the world 1,000 years before never crossed his mind. The three companions made their way north toward the Wind Shrine, following roads that grew increasingly empty as they traveled. The lack of wind had created an eerie silence, broken only by their footsteps and the occasional bird call. They camped that first night, sharing stories around a fire. Lenna spoke of her kingdom and her worry for her father. Galuf tried to remember anything about himself and failed, growing frustrated with his amnesia, but hiding it behind jokes and false cheer. Bartz said little, uncomfortable with the growing sense that he had been pulled into something larger than a simple escort mission. As they approached the Wind Shrine the next day, they encountered more goblins, larger groups now, organized and aggressive in ways that seemed unusual for the typically disorganized creatures. Bartz and his companions fought them off, but the battles grew more difficult with each encounter. By the time they reached the shrine itself, they were exhausted, their supplies depleted, their weapons nicked and dented from constant combat. The shrine rose before them, an ancient structure built to honor and house the wind crystal, its architecture incorporating elements that seemed to shift and flow like wind made solid. Inside the shrine, they found devastation. The crystal's chamber had been breached, its protective wards shattered. The wind crystal itself, a massive gem that pulsed with power and seemed to contain entire storm systems within its faceted depths, was cracked. As they watched in horror, the crack spread, fractures racing across the crystal's surface like lightning across a sky. King Tycoon stood before the crystal, but something was wrong with him. His movements were stiff, mechanical, his eyes blank and distant. He raised his hands toward the crystal, and power flowed from him into it. Not healing power, but something darker, energy that widened the cracks and deepened the damage. Lenna cried out for her father, but he did not respond, did not even seem to recognize her. Galuf recognized what was happening, even if he could not remember why. King Tycoon was being controlled, manipulated by a force that worked through him to destroy the crystal. Before any of them could act, before they could reach the king or the crystal, the wind crystal shattered completely. The explosion of released energy knocked them all backward, the force of it shaking the entire shrine. For a moment, the world itself seemed to hold its breath, reality adjusting to the absence of a force that had shaped it for a millennium. When the light faded and they could see again, they found King Tycoon collapsed on the floor, unconscious but alive, the controlling force apparently withdrawn now that its work was done. But more significantly, they found the crystal's fragments, shards that still glowed with residual power. As Bartz reached out to touch one of these shards, he felt something awaken inside him, a connection forming between his consciousness and the crystal's remaining essence. Knowledge flowed into his mind, not as words or images, but as pure understanding. He suddenly knew how to be a knight, how to wield weapons and armor he had never trained with, how to channel defensive techniques that would protect his allies. Lenna and Galuf experienced the same awakening, each gaining their own understanding of different abilities. The crystal's final act, as it died, was to choose champions, to grant mortals the knowledge and power they would need for the trials ahead. A ghostly image appeared above the crystal shards, King Tycoon's face, but translucent and ethereal, as though he stood in two places at once. The image spoke, warning them of Exdeath, explaining that the crystals sealed away a terrible evil, that the destruction of the wind crystal was only the beginning, that the other 3 crystals in this world would soon be targeted. They had been chosen as warriors of light, defenders of the crystals, the world's only hope against the coming darkness. Before they could ask questions or demand more information, the ghostly image faded, leaving them alone with the unconscious king and the shattered remnants of what had been one of the 4 pillars holding reality together. They carried King Tycoon out of the shrine, back toward Tycoon Castle, but before they reached the kingdom, they were intercepted by royal guards. The king was taken for medical treatment, but the guards regarded Bartz and his companions with suspicion. They had been present when the crystal shattered. Perhaps they were responsible. Perhaps they were agents of whatever force had attacked the shrine. The guards escorted them to Tycoon Castle, though escort was perhaps too polite a word for being marched along with weapons at their backs. At the castle, the minister who governed in King Tycoon's absence questioned them extensively. Lenna's status as princess vouched for her character, but Bartz, and especially Galuf, with his amnesia and mysterious arrival by meteor, remained under suspicion. The minister was not hostile, merely cautious, aware that the kingdom faced unprecedented crisis and that identifying enemies was just as important as identifying allies. The interrogation was interrupted by news from the south. The water crystal, housed in a tower in the Kingdom of Wolves, was reported to be showing signs of strain. If the pattern held, if someone or something was systematically destroying the crystals, then Wolves would be the next target. Lenna insisted that she and her companions travel to Wolves immediately to try to prevent the crystal's destruction. The minister, seeing little alternative and recognizing that these 3 had at least tried to protect the wind crystal, agreed to let them go. He provided supplies, fresh weapons, and most importantly, information about how to reach Wolves. But travel presented its own problems. The wind's absence meant ships could not sail, at least not in any reliable way. They would need to cross water to reach Wolves, but without wind, they could not do so by conventional means. Galuf, his practical mind working despite his amnesia, suggested a simple solution. The town of Thule, not far from Tycoon, was home to pirates. Pirates traditionally were not dependent on any single kingdom's rules or resources. Perhaps pirates had ways of moving ships that did not rely on wind, and even if they did not, well, perhaps the pirates could be persuaded to help, one way or another. The journey to Thule took them through the Torna Canal, a waterway that connected different bodies of water and served as a major shipping route. The canal was sealed by a massive door, and the key to that door was held by an old man named Zok, a friend of Lenna's from her childhood. They found Zok in Thule, and after some initial reluctance, he agreed to lend them the key. But he pulled Bartz aside before they left and made a request. Keep Lenna safe. She was brave, perhaps too brave for her own good, and she would charge into danger without hesitation if she thought it might help others. Someone needed to watch her back, to be the pragmatic one when she could not afford to be. Bartz accepted the responsibility without quite understanding why. He was a wanderer, not a bodyguard. His plan had been to help them reach the Wind Shrine and then return to his travels. But somehow, imperceptibly, that plan had changed. He was invested now in Lenna's quest, in understanding what had happened to Galuf, in discovering who or what was destroying the crystals. The wanderer who had lived for nothing beyond the next horizon found himself anchored by purpose. And while part of him resented this loss of freedom, another part, a part that sounded disturbingly like his father's voice, whispered that this was what he had been training for all along. Using Zok's key, they opened the Torna Canal and made their way to the pirates' hideout on the coast. The hideout was built into natural cave systems, hidden from casual observation, accessible only by those who knew the secret passages through the rocks. Inside, they found a ship, a beautiful vessel with sleek lines and clever engineering, moored in an underground harbour. But before they could even consider stealing it, they were surrounded by pirates who emerged from the shadows with weapons drawn. The pirate captain stepped forward, and Bartz felt his assumptions about pirates shift dramatically. The captain was young, possibly younger than Bartz himself, with purple hair and clothing that somehow managed to be both practical for seafaring and distinctly stylish. But what surprised Bartz most was that the captain was clearly well-spoken and educated, not the rough savage he had unconsciously expected. The captain introduced themselves as Faris and made it clear in no uncertain terms that the ship was not leaving without proper authorization, which none of them had. Lenna, in a desperate gambit, revealed her identity as Prince of Tycoon, hoping that royal authority might sway the pirate captain. Faris seemed unimpressed at first, making jokes about ransom and hostages that held an edge that suggested the jokes might not be entirely jokes. But then, Lenna showed Faris her pendant, a piece of jewelry that had been in the royal family for generations, a symbol of their connection to the Windrake and the ancient covenant between the royal line and the forces of nature. Something shifted in Faris's expression when they saw the pendant. The pirate captain reached into their own shirt and pulled out an identical pendant, somehow dirty and weathered, but unmistakably the same design. The revelation hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Faris studied Lenna's face with new intensity, searching for something, perhaps confirmation of a possibility too overwhelming to voice immediately. The pirates in the background shifted uneasily, sensing that something significant was happening but not understanding what. Faris made a decision. They would help. The ship, called Sildra, after the sea dragon, that served as both companion and propulsion for the vessel, would take them to Walls. Faris offered no explanation for this sudden cooperation, and the pirate crew, long accustomed to their captain's inexplicable decisions, began preparing the ship for departure without question. But as they sailed toward Walls, as the crew busied themselves with ropes and sails that remained frustratingly slack in the windless air, Faris pulled Lenna aside for a private conversation. The story that emerged was one of loss and survival, and questions that had haunted Faris for as long as memory stretched back. Faris had no recollection of life before the age of 5. The earliest memory was of being pulled from the ocean by pirates, half drowned, clutching a pendant and nothing else. The pirates had raised Faris as one of their own, teaching sailing and navigation, combat and command, the skills needed to survive in a life outside conventional society. When the old captain died, Faris had taken command, earning the crew's respect through competence and courage rather than any inherited authority. But the pendant had always been a mystery, a link to a past that remained frustratingly out of reach. Faris had assumed it was perhaps from wealthy parents, merchants maybe, or minor nobility who had lost a child to the sea and moved on with their lives. The possibility that it might connect to royalty, to the very kingdom whose coast the pirates frequented, had seemed too fantastic to seriously consider. Yet here stood Lenna, wearing an identical pendant, claiming to be the princess of Tycoon, and when Faris looked at her face, really looked, there were similarities, the shape of the eyes, the set of the jaw, features that might belong to siblings. Lenna's voice shook as she spoke the name. Sarisa. her older sister, lost at sea when Lenna was barely more than an infant. The loss had devastated their father, had haunted the kingdom for years. Every anniversary of the disappearance, King Tycoon would stand at the shore and look out over the water, hoping against hope that somehow his eldest daughter would return. Could Faris be Sarisa? Could the pirate captain who had just agreed to help them be Lenna's lost sister? Faris refused to commit to the possibility, at least not aloud. The evidence was suggestive but not conclusive. Identical pendants might be coincidence. Similar features might be wishful thinking, minds seeing connections that were not truly there. And even if it were true, even if Faris was indeed Sarisa, what then? Faris had no memory of being a princess, no connection to Tycoon beyond proximity. The pirates were family now, the ship was home, and returning to a castle and a life of royal duty held no appeal. Better to focus on the immediate crisis, on reaching Walls and trying to prevent whatever had destroyed the wind crystal from claiming the water crystal as well. The journey to Walls was tense. Sildra, the sea dragon, pulled the ship through waters that should have been assisted by wind and current, but now lay still and heavy. The dragon's massive form moved beneath the surface, its scaled body occasionally breaking above the waves, its intelligence evident in the way it responded to Faris's commands and seemed to anticipate navigational needs before they were spoken. The bond between Faris and Sildra was clearly deep, forged over years of mutual reliance and respect. They reached Walls as the sun set, the castle town's lights reflecting off water that barely moved. Walls was built around its crystal tower, a structure that rose higher than any building Bartz had seen before, its architecture seeming to incorporate water itself into the design, fountains and channels flowing through and around the stonework in ways that suggested both aesthetic and practical purpose. The tower was said to reach down as far as it reached up, with lower levels extending deep underground, where the water crystal rested, protected by layers of stone and magical wards. The party sought audience with King Walls, hoping to convince him to evacuate the tower and seal it against intruders. But the king was reluctant to accept their warnings. The water crystal had stood for a millennium. It had survived wars and catastrophes. What threat could be so dire that it would succeed where countless previous dangers had failed? The destruction of the wind crystal was certainly concerning, but perhaps it was an isolated incident, a unique vulnerability in Tycoon's protections, rather than evidence of a systematic assault on all four crystals. The king's chancellor, an advisor named Kabalos, who had served the royal family for decades, was even more dismissive. He suggested, with barely concealed contempt, that these travelers were perhaps overstating the danger, or worse, that they might be agents provocateurs sent to sow panic and destabilize the kingdom. After all, who were they? A wanderer, an amnesiac who arrived in a meteor, and a pirate captain, of all things. Not exactly credentials that inspired confidence in their warnings of apocalyptic danger. Frustrated but not surprised by the reception, the party left the throne room and explored the town, gathering information and supplies for whatever confrontation might be coming. In the castle's water tower, an engineering marvel that provided water pressure for the castle's many fountains and defensive systems, they discovered something disturbing. The machinery that amplified the water crystal's power was running at maximum capacity, drawing energy at rates that the engineers admitted were unsustainable. The king had ordered this, driven by a desire to prove Walls' strength, to demonstrate that his kingdom could not be intimidated by vague warnings of danger. But this display of power was having the opposite of its intended effect. The increased draw on the crystal was weakening it, Not immediately, but incrementally. Each hour of maximum amplification draining reserves that had taken decades to accumulate. The engineers expressed concern, but admitted they lacked the authority to countermand the king's orders. They could only monitor the crystal and hope that someone convinced the king to reduce the power draw before permanent damage occurred. That night, as the party rested in an inn near the crystal tower, alarms rang out across walls. The crystal was under attack, not by external invaders, but by something that had infiltrated from within. The party rushed to the tower, fighting through guards who had been transformed into hostile creatures, soldiers whose eyes glowed with the same blank intensity that had possessed King Tycoon. They climbed through the tower's levels, each floor presenting new corrupted guardians, each battle harder than the last. In the crystal chamber at the tower's deepest level, they found the source of the corruption. Garula, a massive beast that served as the kingdom's sacred guardian, had been twisted by dark magic, its mind overridden by the same force that had controlled King Tycoon. The creature charged with protecting the crystal now worked to destroy it, smashing against the protective barriers with a strength that made the entire chamber shake. King Wolsey stood nearby, struggling against magical bonds that held him immobile, forcing him to watch as the guardian he had raised from a calf worked to destroy everything he had sworn to protect. The battle with Garula was brutal. The creature was immensely strong, its attacks capable of killing in a single blow if they connected solidly. But it was also in pain, tormented by the magic that controlled it, fighting against its own nature even as it followed the commands implanted in its mind. Bartz, Lenna, Galuf, and Faris worked together, combining the abilities they had gained from the wind crystal's shards with their own skills, learning in the heat of combat how to coordinate their attacks, how to cover each other's weaknesses, how to fight as a unit rather than as individuals who happened to be in the same battle. They brought Garula down, but the victory was bittersweet. As the creature died, the controlling magic released it, and in its final moments, it looked at King Wars with recognition and something that might have been sorrow. The king wept openly, cradling the guardian's massive head, whispering apologies and thanks, and goodbye to an animal that had been both servant and friend for longer than most citizens of Wolsey had been alive. But there was no time to properly mourn. The water crystal, weakened by the amplifiers and damaged by Garula's attacks, began to crack. The party rushed to it, trying desperately to find some way to seal the damage, to prevent what had happened to the wind crystal from repeating. But they were too late. Had been too late from the moment the amplifiers were pushed to maximum output, had perhaps been too late from the moment the wind crystal shattered and weakened the overall structure that bound the four crystals together. The water crystal exploded, not with fire, but with a deluge, a flood of released energy that took liquid form, water pouring from the shattered gem in quantities that should have been impossible, as though an entire ocean had been compressed within the crystal's facets and was now free to expand. The chamber flooded instantly, water rising to chest height in seconds, and they barely escaped, swimming through corridors that had become aquatic tunnels, fighting toward the surface before they drowned in the very element the crystal had represented. They emerged gasping and drenched in the tower's upper levels, where the water had not yet reached. King Wulfs was with them, his grief transformed into determination. He understood now, understood that the threat was real, that some force was systematically destroying the crystals, and that no kingdom alone could stand against such a threat. He pledged Wulf's support to their cause, promised to coordinate with other kingdoms, to prepare defenses for the remaining two crystals, to do whatever was necessary to prevent further destruction. But as with the wind crystal, the water crystal granted gifts in its dying moments. The party felt new knowledge flooding into their minds, new job abilities, new ways to combine and channel the power that had been entrusted to them. They were growing stronger, but they were also learning a disturbing truth. The crystals were not just being destroyed, they were being drained, their energy taken for some purpose they did not yet understand. And with each crystal that fell, the dimensional barrier between the two worlds grew weaker. Galuf felt something stir in his memory, fragments of recognition that still would not coalesce into full recollection. He knew this pattern, had seen something like it before, though where and when remained frustratingly out of reach. He mentioned this to the others, trying to articulate the sense of déjà vu that plagued him. But without complete memories, he could offer only feelings and impressions, rather than actionable intelligence. Their next destination was clear. The fire crystal was housed in Karnak, an industrial city whose entire economy and infrastructure depended on the crystal's power. Karnak had taken the amplification technology pioneered by Sid and expanded it to unprecedented scales, building factories and power plants that drew massive amounts of energy from the crystal, transforming that power into mechanical output that drove the modern world's industry. If the pattern held, Karnak would be the next target, and given how heavily they taxed their crystal, it might already be too late to prevent its destruction. But reaching Karnak required crossing the desert, and the desert was home to dangers beyond mere environmental hazards. They would need transportation, supplies, and most importantly, they would need to move quickly. Every hour they delayed was another hour for whatever force controlled Exdeath's seal to weaken and destroy the fire crystal. King Walls provided them with a ship, one of the new models that used crystal-powered engines rather than wind, and they set sail immediately, racing toward the southern continent and the fires that burned eternally in Karnak's industrial heart. The journey gave them time to rest, to process what they had experienced, and to begin truly understanding each other beyond the surface level of names and immediate circumstances. Bartz spoke of his father, of the wandering life Dorgan had lived, of the promise to see the world that had seemed so simple when made but now carried weight Bartz had not anticipated. He did not mention that his father had been one of the warriors who sealed Exdeath, did not mention it because he did not know, had never been told the true nature of Dorgan's past or purpose. Lenna spoke of Tycoon, of growing up in the shadow of a lost sister, of a father who had always been kind, but also distant, as though part of him remained focused on something far away. She spoke of her love for animals, inherited from her father, and demonstrated it through her gentle interactions with Faris's pet sea dragon whenever Sildra surfaced near the ship. She had a gift, an instinctive understanding of creatures' needs and emotions that went beyond mere training or intellectual knowledge. Faris remained guarded, uncomfortable with the possibility that they might be Sarisa, unwilling to embrace an identity that felt alien despite the evidence. The pirates had been family for 15 years, had raised them, taught them everything about surviving in a world that did not care whether you lived or died. The idea of abandoning that family for a castle and a kingdom full of strangers, even if those strangers were blood relatives, seemed like a betrayal of the people who had actually been there through the years that mattered. Galuf tried to remember and failed, over and over, each failure making him more frustrated and more determined. He knew he had come to this world for a reason, knew that his arrival by meteor was not accident, but purpose, But what that purpose was remained locked behind walls in his mind that would not come down no matter how hard he pushed against them. He contributed to conversations, made jokes, kept spirits up through forced cheer. But privately, he worried that whatever he had forgotten might be the key to stopping the crisis, that his amnesia might cost them everything. They reached the southern continent and made their way inland toward Karnak, following roads that grew increasingly busy with industrial traffic. Massive wagons pulled by chocobos transported raw materials toward the city, while other wagons carried finished goods in the opposite direction. The air itself tasted different here, metallic and sharp, with an undercurrent of smoke and chemicals that spoke of industry operating at scales nature had never intended. Karnak itself was built around its fire-powered industry. The city's architecture incorporated advanced magical engineering, crystal-powered furnaces, and enchanted forges that produced goods and materials at scales previous generations had never imagined. Towers rose from the industrial district, venting heat and magical residue into air that shimmered with thermal distortion. The constant sound of machinery provided an industrial rhythm that never ceased, day or night. The hum of crystal amplifiers and the ring of hammers on anvils blending into a symphony of production. Workers moved through the streets with the exhausted gait of people who labored too long for too little, their faces marked with the soot of furnaces and the fatigue of endless shifts. The city was wealthy, certainly, but that wealth was concentrated in the hands of the factory owners and merchants who profited from the workers' endless labor. The fire crystal sat at the city's heart, housed within a massive power plant that channeled its energy through countless amplifiers and transformers. The crystal itself was barely visible through the machinery that surrounded it, a glowing core wrapped in metal and tubes and cables that drew off its power and distributed it throughout the city. The plant's chief engineer, a man named Sid Pravia, who was credited with pioneering the amplification technology, greeted them with a mixture of pride and growing concern. Sid had built this system, had designed the amplifiers and power distribution networks that made modern civilization possible. He believed in progress, in using the crystal's power to improve lives, to free humanity from the constraints of muscle and wind and natural limitation. But lately, he had begun to notice something disturbing. The crystals were not infinite. The more power drawn from them, the weaker they became. He had warned the city's leaders, had recommended reducing the power draw to sustainable levels, but his warnings had been dismissed. Industry demanded power. The people demanded the comfort and convenience that power provided. Reducing output was political suicide, economic catastrophe, and so the amplifiers ran at maximum capacity, while Sid watched his greatest achievement slowly destroy the very foundation it was built upon. The party explained what had happened to the wind and water crystals, described the controlled guardians, and the possessing force that seemed to orchestrate the destruction. Sid paled as he listened, understanding immediately the implications. If someone was actively attacking the crystals, and if the crystals were already weakened by industrial overuse, then Karnak's fire crystal was not just vulnerable, but actively endangered. They needed to shut down the amplifiers to reduce the stress on the crystal, to buy time for proper defenses to be organized. But shutting down the amplifiers meant shutting down Karnak's industry, meant plunging the city into darkness and idleness, meant economic disruption on a scale that might spark riots and revolt. CED hesitated, torn between his scientific understanding of the danger and his awareness of the social consequences of acting on that understanding. The party did not have the luxury of hesitation. They needed to reach the crystal, to protect it, And if that meant cutting through industrial machinery and political complications, then that was what they would do. They fought their way deeper into the power plant, past automated defenses that had been activated by the same corrupting force that had controlled King Tycoon and Garula. The machinery itself seemed to turn against them. Pipes exploding with superheated steam, gears and pistons crushing and grinding, electrical systems discharging lethal voltages in arcs that left scorch marks on metal walls. The plant had become a death trap, its own systems weaponized against intruders, and only their growing mastery of the job abilities granted by the fallen crystals allowed them to survive. In the chamber that housed the fire crystal, they found Queen Karnak, the city's ruler, standing before the massive gem with arms outstretched. Unlike King Tycoon and Garula, she was not merely possessed, but had been transformed, her body twisted by fire and dark magic into something that burned with internal flames, a creature of living fire that existed only to complete its terrible mission. She did not speak, did not acknowledge their presence with anything resembling human awareness. She simply attacked, flames erupting from her transformed body in waves that turned the crystal chamber into an inferno. The battle was desperate. Fire magic, which might normally have been their most effective tool given the tactical situations they faced, was useless against a creature made of flames. They had to rely on water-based attacks and physical combat, had to fight an opponent who could not feel pain and would not retreat or surrender. Queen Karnak fell eventually, her body dissolving into ash and embers, and in her final moment, something human flickered in her eyes, recognition and horror at what she had become and what she had done. But her destruction, as they had feared, came too late. The fire crystal, weakened by years of overuse and damaged by the Queen's attacks, began to fracture. Sid ran into the chamber, desperate to do something, anything, to prevent the catastrophe his life's work had helped create. He threw switches, rerouted power, tried to drain off the excess energy building up within the crystal. But the damage was too extensive. The crystal shattered, and the explosion was not water or wind, but fire. Pure elemental fury that should have incinerated everyone in the chamber. They survived only because Sid had managed to activate emergency barriers in the seconds before the explosion. Transparent walls of force that contained most of the blast. But the barriers were not perfect, and the heat that escaped was enough to set fire to the entire power plant. Automated systems tried to contain the blaze and failed, the fire spreading too quickly, consuming machinery and wooden support structures, racing through corridors and ventilation shafts with hungry speed. The party barely escaped, Sid guiding them through maintenance tunnels and emergency exits, the roar of flames and exploding equipment chasing them toward the surface. They emerged into Karnak's streets to find the city in chaos. The power plant's destruction had caused a cascading failure throughout the industrial district. Fires spreading from building to building, people fleeing with whatever possessions they could carry. The party helped where they could, pulling people from burning structures, guiding crowds away from areas where industrial chemicals threatened to explode, fighting fires with magic and determination. But the scale of the disaster was beyond their ability to prevent or contain. Karnak would survive, but it would never be the same. Its industrial heart burned out, its crystal gone. In the aftermath, as dawn broke over the smoking ruins, Sid found them and handed over something he had salvaged from the power plant before its final collapse. Fragments of the fire crystal, still glowing with residual power, still capable of granting the knowledge and abilities that had become their primary weapons against the forces arrayed against them. The party absorbed the crystal's gifts, felt new job, classes opening in their minds, new ways to combine abilities and approaches to combat. But more importantly, Sid gave them information. He explained the full history of the amplification technology, how he and his grandson Mid had pioneered it with the best of intentions, how it had been adopted and expanded beyond anything they had imagined, how the 4 crystals in this world had all been weakened by decades of industrial use. And he told them something that chilled their blood. There were 4 more crystals in another world, a parallel dimension that existed alongside their own. And if the pattern continued, if someone was systematically destroying all 8 crystals, then both worlds were in danger of something catastrophic. Galuf reacted to this information with visible distress, not remembering, but knowing somehow that this was important, that the second world was connected to his purpose. He looked at the others with frustration written across his face, trying desperately to force his memories to surface, to recall why the mention of a second world felt simultaneously familiar and urgent. The others watched him struggle, wanting to help but not knowing how, aware that the amnesia that gripped him might be as much magical as physical, a seal placed on his mind for reasons they did not yet understand. Their next destination, the last crystal in this world, was the Earth Crystal. It was located in the ruins of Crescent, an ancient city that had been abandoned centuries ago, its inhabitants fled or dead from some long-forgotten catastrophe. The ruins were said to be located in the Quicksand Desert, a vast wasteland where the sand itself moved and shifted like water, where entire dunes could swallow unwary travelers in seconds, where the heat during the day was lethal and the cold at night nearly as dangerous. Reaching the ruins would be difficult. Reaching them in time to prevent the Earth Crystal's destruction might be impossible. But they had no choice. 3 crystals had fallen despite their best efforts. The Earth Crystal was their last chance in this world, their final opportunity to prevent whatever catastrophe would result from all 4 crystals being destroyed. They gathered supplies, purchased desert gear from merchants in Karnak's still functioning markets, and prepared for a journey that would test their endurance in ways that combat had not. The Quicksand Desert lived up to its reputation. The sand moved beneath their feet, creating hills that collapsed without warning, forming quicksand pits that could drag someone down in seconds. The sun beat down with relentless force, heat radiating from both above and below as the sand absorbed and reflected solar radiation. They traveled at night when possible, rested in the shade of rock formations during the day, rationed water carefully, and pushed themselves to their physical limits. Deep in the desert, they found the Library of the Ancients, a structure that had somehow survived when the rest of Crescent fell. The library was maintained by scholars who had dedicated their lives to preserving knowledge from the ancient world, texts and maps and historical records that documented events from before the world splitting. The head scholar, an elderly man named Kidana, greeted them with cautious hospitality, curious about why travelers would venture so deep into the desert, but wary of revealing too much until he understood their intentions. The party explained their quest, described the fallen crystals and the possessed guardians, asked for any information that might help them protect the Earth Crystal. Kidana's expression grew grave as he listened. He led them deep into the library's archives, past rooms filled with books and scrolls and tablets inscribed with languages few could still read, to a chamber where the oldest and most precious documents were kept. There, he showed them texts that described events from 1,000 years ago, from the time when the world was split. The text spoke of Enuo, the immortal sorcerer who had traded his eternal life for power over the void. They described his campaign of destruction and the 12 warriors who had opposed him. They explained how the world had been split to seal away the void, how each world had been given 4 crystals to maintain the dimensional barrier, how the peace of centuries had been purchased through a delicate balance that depended on all 8 crystals remaining intact and strong. And the texts warned of what would happen if that balance was broken. If all 8 crystals were destroyed, the seal on the void would fail. The 2 worlds would merge back into one, but that merging would tear open the interdimensional rift and release the void back into reality. Everything that existed would be in danger of being consumed by the same annihilating force that Enuo had wielded 1,000 years before. Galuf read these texts and felt something crack inside his mind, the seal on his memories beginning to fracture under the weight of recognition. He knew this story, not from reading but from living it. He was from the other world, the second world, and he had come here not by accident, but by design, sent as a messenger to warn this world's inhabitants that their crystals were under attack. His memories flooded back in a rush that left him gasping, 30 years of life returning all at once, and with those memories came understanding of the true scope of what they faced. Exdeath. The name came from Galuf's lips with a mixture of recognition and horror. Exdeath was not merely attacking the crystals. He had been sealed away using the crystals' power, and their destruction was systematically weakening his prison. With each crystal that fell, Exdeath grew closer to freedom, and if all 8 crystals were destroyed, he would be released with full access to the power he had possessed 30 years ago. But now, with 3 decades of imprisonment feeding his rage and determination. Galuf explained everything he remembered. He spoke of his world, of the kingdoms and conflicts that existed there. He described the 4 Dawn warriors who had fought Exdeath 3 decades before, how they had sealed him in this world, how Dorgan had remained behind as a guardian. At the mention of Dorgan's name, Bartz felt something lurch in his chest, a recognition he did not want to acknowledge. His father had been a Dawn warrior. His father had sealed away Exdeath. His father's entire life had been spent monitoring that seal. And now Bartz, wanderer and reluctant hero, was fighting to prevent the breaking of a seal his father had died protecting. The revelation transformed something in Bartz's understanding of himself and his purpose. This was not random chance. This was legacy. His father had trained him, perhaps unconsciously, perhaps deliberately, despite claiming to want Bartz to live free, for exactly this fight. The wandering, the survival skills, the basic combat training, all of it had been preparation for a war Dorgan had hoped would never come, but had known might be inevitable. They had little time to process these revelations. The scholars reported that strange vibrations were emanating from beneath the library, from the deeper ruins where the earth crystal was housed. The attack was already underway. They descended into the ancient structures beneath the library, fighting through monsters that had been warped by Exdeath's corrupting influence, navigating passages that had not been traveled in centuries, making their way toward the crystal chamber deep in the earth. But they were too late, had perhaps been too late from the moment they left Karnak, or from the moment the fire crystal fell, or from the very beginning when the wind crystal shattered. The earth crystal was already cracking when they arrived, already dying despite their desperate rush to reach it. The chamber shook with the force of its failing, stone crumbling from the ceiling, the ground itself splitting as the crystal's stabilizing influence vanished. And standing before the crystal was King Tycoon, but not possessed this time, not controlled. He stood there willingly, his face twisted by an expression that mixed triumph and agony, his body wreathed in dark energy that pulsed with each beat of his heart. Lenna cried out, begged her father to stop, to explain what was happening, why he was doing this. The king turned to face his daughter, and when he spoke, his voice was layered. Two voices speaking in imperfect synchronization, Tycoon's familiar tones overlaid with something deeper and colder. Exdeath had not merely possessed Tycoon, he had merged with him, using the king's body as a conduit into the physical world, even while most of his being remained sealed. Through Tycoon, Exdeath had orchestrated the destruction of all four crystals, had manipulated guardians and queens, and the king himself into weakening and shattering the very things that imprisoned him. And now, with the earth crystal falling, Exdeath was about to be completely free. The party attacked, trying to destroy Exdeath's physical anchor, trying to stop the earth crystal's destruction, but they were fighting both the Dark Sorcerer and King Tycoon's body, and neither Lenna nor Faris could bring themselves to strike with full force against their father. Bartz and Galuf carried the battle, pouring everything they had into attacks that sought to separate Exdeath from his host, to force the dark entity out of Tycoon's body without killing the king in the process. The earth crystal shattered, and the explosion sent everyone flying backward. When the dust cleared, Exdeath stood there in his true form, no longer hiding within a host, a massive figure in dark armor that seemed to absorb light, his face hidden behind a helmet that revealed nothing human. King Tycoon lay nearby, unconscious but alive, freed from Exdeath's control but broken by the experience of having his body and will subverted for so long. Exdeath regarded the party with something that might have been amusement. He thanked them, mockingly, for helping him achieve his freedom, for rushing from crystal to crystal and always arriving just late enough to watch them fall. Their efforts had been futile, their determination meaningless, their strength insufficient to change anything. Now he would return to his own world, would destroy the four crystals there, and when all 8 had fallen, he would claim the void and reshape both worlds according to his vision. The Dark Sorcerer opened a portal to the second world and stepped through, leaving them behind with a dying crystal and a critically injured king. The chamber continued to collapse, and they had to choose between pursuing Exdeath or rescuing Tycoon. Faris and Lenna made the choice, grabbing their father and fleeing toward the surface, while Bartz and Galuf grabbed the earth crystal shards that still glowed with fading power. They escaped just as the ruins completed their collapse, the entire structure coming down in a catastrophic failure that buried the ancient library and everything it contained beneath thousands of tons of stone and sand. They emerged onto the desert surface, gasping and covered in dust, carrying an unconscious king and fragments of a shattered crystal. All 4 crystals in this world had fallen. The seal was broken. Exdeath was free and already moving to destroy the crystals in Galuf's world. They had failed, completely and utterly, and now the second stage of their quest began. They would have to pursue Exdeath to the other world, would have to try to protect crystals they knew nothing about in kingdoms they had never visited, would have to fight an enemy who had just demonstrated his ability to manipulate them and render their best efforts meaningless. But they had gained something as well. The earth crystal shards granted them new abilities, new job classes, new ways to combine their powers. And they had information now, knowledge of what they faced and why. Exdeath wanted the void, wanted the annihilating power that had nearly destroyed the world 1,000 years before. If they could prevent him from destroying the crystals in the second world, if they could protect even one of those remaining 4, they might be able to prevent the void's release. The portal Exdeath had used to return to the second world remained open, an unstable tear in reality that flickered and pulsed with dangerous energies. Galuf stared at it with obvious longing, wanting desperately to return to his home world, to warn his people, to take up the fight he had left 30 years ago when the Dawn warriors sealed Exdeath away. But he hesitated, looking at his new companions, at the young people who had been pulled into a conflict they never asked for, at Bartz, who carried the legacy of Dorgan without having known it, at Lenna and Faris, who had discovered their sisterhood in the middle of apocalyptic crisis. Bartz made the decision for all of them. They would pursue Exdeath. They would travel to the second world and protect those crystals. And if they failed, if all 8 crystals fell and the void was released, then at least they would fail together, fighting until the very end against the darkness that threatened to consume both worlds. It was not a particularly heroic declaration, not the stirring speech of legend, just a simple statement of intention from a former wanderer who had found purpose in protecting the people around him. They carried King Tycoon back to the library's scholars, who promised to care for him and see him return to his kingdom if he survived his injuries. Then the party turned toward the portal, toward the flickering tear between dimensions, and without further hesitation, they stepped through into a world none of them except Galuf had ever seen, into a realm where Exdeath was already moving against the crystals, where time was running out, and where the final battles to prevent apocalypse would be fought. The transition between worlds was disorienting, not painful, but deeply wrong, like moving through space that was not meant to contain physical matter, breathing air that existed in contradictory states simultaneously. Reality twisted around them, and for a moment, they seemed to exist in both worlds at once, seeing overlaid images of 2 different skies, 2 different landscapes, 2 versions of where they stood. Then the portal released them, and they tumbled out onto solid ground in a world that looked simultaneously familiar and completely alien. The first thing Bartz noticed was that the sky was a different color, subtly but unmistakably different, a shade of blue that his eyes insisted was wrong, even though he could not articulate exactly how. The second thing he noticed was the scale. Everything in this world seemed larger, grander, built with an ambition and scope that the first world had, abandoned or never possessed. The mountains reached higher, the valleys cut deeper. The architecture around them was more elaborate and ancient, suggesting civilizations that had reached heights the first world had not imagined. They had emerged near a castle, a massive structure built on a cliff overlooking the ocean, its walls and towers suggesting both military strength and royal grandeur. Galuf recognized it immediately, emotion flooding his face. This was Castle Baal, his home, the kingdom he ruled. He had been gone for only days from his perspective, though subjective time became strange when traveling between dimensions. But those days had felt like an eternity. Now he was back, returned not in triumph, but in desperation, bearing news of failure and catastrophe. The castle guards recognized Galuf instantly and rushed to meet him, relief and concern mixing in their expressions. The entire kingdom had been in uproar since their king had launched himself into space in a meteor, determined to cross dimensions to warn the first world about Exdeath's awakening. No one had known if he would survive the journey, if he would succeed in his mission, or if they would ever see him again. Now here he stood, returned but accompanied by strangers, and bearing an expression that suggested his news was not good. Inside the throne room, Galuf's advisors and military commanders gathered to hear his report. The king explained everything that had happened: the destruction of the 4 crystals in the first world, Exdeath's release from his prison, the Dark Sorcerer's return to the second world to continue his campaign, The advisors listened with growing horror, understanding that the threat they had hoped was contained in another dimension had instead grown stronger and was now loose in their own world. But Galuf's report was interrupted by the arrival of someone unexpected. A young woman burst into the throne room, ignoring protocol and the guards' attempts to stop her. She was perhaps 14 years old, with determination written across her features and a staff held in her hands with the confidence of someone trained in its use. She looked at Galuf with a mixture of relief and frustration, clearly wanting to embrace him while simultaneously wanting to berate him for his reckless dimensional journey. This was Krile Mare Baldesion, Galuf's granddaughter, and the sight of her stopped Galuf mid-sentence. He had left without telling her where he was going, had disappeared in the middle of the night to pursue a mission he knew was desperately dangerous, had taken the risk of dimensional travel without saying goodbye because he could not bear the thought of her trying to follow or talk him out of it. Now she stood before him, having clearly been frantic with worry, and Galuf found himself doing what few things in the world could make him do. He apologized, sincerely, and without his usual jokes or deflections. Krile forgave him, of course, but she also made clear that she was not going to be left behind again. If her grandfather was fighting to save the world, then she would fight beside him. She possessed her own abilities, her own magic, and her own connection to the crystal's power. More importantly, she possessed something unusual and valuable. Krile could speak with animals, could understand their language, and communicate with them in ways that went beyond simple beast mastery. It was a rare gift, one that had marked her as special since childhood, and in the battles to come, it would prove invaluable. Bartz, Lenna, and Faris introduced themselves, explaining their own roles in the story and their determination to continue the fight despite having failed to protect their world's crystals. Krile studied them with an intensity that suggested she was evaluating not just their words, but something deeper, their intentions and character, the truth beneath their statements. After a long moment, she nodded, accepting them as genuine allies rather than potential threats, and welcomed them to bow with a formality that seemed out of place coming from someone so young, but which she carried with surprising grace. The tactical situation was dire. Exdeath had already moved against the first of the second world's 4 crystals. The wind crystal, housed in a shrine in the northern mountains, had been attacked within hours of Exdeath's return. By the time messengers reached Bal with the news, the shrine had already been destroyed and the crystal shattered. Exdeath was moving with unprecedented speed, not bothering with subtlety or manipulation this time, simply attacking directly with overwhelming force. Galuf's advisors reported that they had sent warnings to the kingdoms housing the other 3 crystals, but communication across the second world was not instantaneous, and there was no guarantee the warnings would arrive in time or be taken seriously. The kingdoms of the second world had enjoyed 30 years of peace since Exdeath's defeat. An entire generation had grown up knowing the story of the Dawn Warriors as history rather than lived experience, and many people doubted that the threat could truly have returned after so long. The party needed transportation, a way to cross the second world quickly enough to reach the remaining crystals before Exdeath destroyed them. Galuf mentioned that there had once been airships in the second world, vessels that could fly without depending on dragons or magic, but those ships had been lost or destroyed during the war 30 years ago. However, he knew someone who might be able to help, another of the Dawn Warriors who had specialized in building things, creating devices and weapons that pushed the boundaries of what was thought possible. That warrior was Zezat Matia Surgut, who now ruled the kingdom of Surgut and commanded a fleet of ships that, while not capable of flight, represented the Second World's most advanced maritime technology. If anyone could provide transportation, or at least information about how to reach the remaining crystals quickly, it would be Zezat. Galuf sent word ahead that they were coming, then led the party to Bal's port, where a fast ship was being prepared for their journey. As they prepared to depart, Krile pulled Bartz aside for a private conversation. She had been watching him since his arrival, studying him with that evaluative intensity, and she had questions. She asked about his father, about Dorgan, about what kind of man he had been and how he had died. Bartz answered as best he could, describing his father as a wanderer, a teacher, someone who had instilled a love of travel and freedom while also ensuring Bartz knew how to survive and fight when necessary. Krile listened, then shared her own memories of Dorgan. She had been very young when the Dawn Warriors sealed Exdeath, barely old enough to form lasting memories, but she remembered a man who had been kind to her, who had treated her not as a child to be dismissed, but as a person whose thoughts and feelings mattered. She remembered how her grandfather had mourned when Dorgan chose to remain in the First World, how Galuf had lost not just a companion but a brother in all but blood. And she told Bartz something he had not known, something his father had never mentioned. Dorgan had been married before, in the Second World, and had lost his wife to the war against Exdeath. Stella had not been his first love, but his second chance at happiness, and perhaps that explained why he had held on so tightly, while also holding back so much of his past. The journey to Surgat took them across waters that were rougher than those in the First World, seas that moved with currents shaped by different continental configurations and weather patterns influenced by slightly different physical laws. The Second World was not radically different from the first, but it was different enough that Bartz, Lenna, and Faris noticed the subtle wrongness of everything around them, the sense of being in a place that was almost but not quite home. They reached Surgat as night fell, the kingdom's lights reflecting off water that seemed darker and deeper than oceans they had sailed before. The castle was built on an island connected to the mainland by a massive bridge, an architectural marvel that spoke to the engineering prowess Surgat was famous for. Zezat met them at the dock personally, an older man whose hair had gone grey, but whose eyes remained sharp, and whose bearing suggested a warrior who had remained in fighting shape despite decades of ruling rather than adventuring. The reunion between Galuf and Zezat was emotional but brief. They had not seen each other in 30 years, had both aged in the time since the Dawn Warriors' final mission, had each built lives and kingdoms while carrying the weight of what they had done and what they had lost. But there was no time for extended reminiscing. Zezat had received word about the Wind Crystal's destruction and had already mobilized his fleet, preparing for war against an enemy he had hoped never to face again. But Zezat had troubling news. Exdeath had not merely returned stronger. He had learned from his previous defeat. The Dark Sorcerer had erected a barrier around his castle, a magical shield so powerful that nothing could pass through it from the outside. Ships crashed against it and shattered. Magic dissipated on contact with it. Even catapulted projectiles bounced off harmlessly. As long as that barrier stood, there was no way to assault Exdeath directly, no way to stop him from moving against the crystals at his leisure. The barrier drew its power from 4 sub-barriers positioned at key locations around the Second World. Destroying those 4 generators would bring down the main barrier and allow access to Exdeath's castle. But each generator was heavily guarded, protected by monsters and corrupted warriors, designed to be difficult to reach and harder to destroy. It would take a coordinated assault, multiple teams moving simultaneously against the generators, to have any hope of bringing down the barrier before Exdeath completed his crystal destruction. Zezat offered his fleet for the assault, volunteer warriors who understood the stakes and were willing to risk everything to stop Exdeath. But he also made clear that he would personally lead one of the assault teams, would not ask his people to face danger he was unwilling to face himself. Galuf accepted this with visible reluctance, understanding the risk, but also understanding that Zezat's pride and sense of duty would not allow any other arrangement. The plan was formed. Zezat would lead his fleet against the barrier generator in the Western Sea, a fortress built on artificial islands that controlled the barrier's oceanic protection. Galuf and the party would assault a generator in the mountains to the east, a facility built into ancient ruins that had been occupied and fortified by Exdeath's forces. Two other teams, composed of warriors from Surgat and Baal, would simultaneously attack the remaining two generators. The assault would begin at dawn, coordinated through magical signal fires that would ensure all four teams moved at once. That night, as the party rested in Surgat Castle, Bartz found himself unable to sleep. He wandered the battlements, looking out over the ocean and the fleet being prepared for the morning's assault, thinking about his father and destiny and the path that had led him from simple wanderer to warrior fighting to prevent apocalypse. Lenna found him there, equally sleepless, and they talked about what had brought them to this point, about whether their efforts mattered when they had already failed to protect 4 crystals, about what would happen if they failed again. Lenna spoke of her father, of King Tycoon lying unconscious in a scholar's care, his body and mind shattered by Exdeath's possession. She spoke of her guilt over not recognizing sooner that something was wrong, of her failure to protect him from the corruption that had used him as a weapon. Bartz listened and offered what comfort he could, pointing out that Exdeath had manipulated everyone, that even the Dawn warriors had only managed to seal him rather than destroy him, that sometimes the best you could do was survive and keep fighting. Faris joined them eventually, having given up on sleep as well, and the 3 of them watched the night sky together, noting the different constellations visible from the second world, patterns of stars that existed in different configurations than those visible from home. They wondered if the stars themselves were different in this dimension, or if they were simply seeing the same stars from a different angle. And the philosophical nature of the question led them into discussions about identity and purpose, and whether they were still the same people they had been before the wind crystal shattered, or whether the journey had transformed them into something new. Dawn came too quickly, and with it, the time for action. The 4 assault teams departed simultaneously, magical signal fires confirming that each group was in position and ready. Zezat led his fleet toward the western barrier generator, ships cutting through morning mist as they approached their target. Galuf led Bartz, Lenna, Faris, and Krile toward the eastern mountains, following paths that grew increasingly treacherous as they climbed toward the ancient ruins where the generator had been installed. The ruins were old, far older than any structure in the First World, suggesting that the Second World's history stretched back further, or had reached greater heights before some ancient catastrophe reduced it to the current state. The architecture was beautiful, even in decay. Carved stone that depicted scenes from myths and histories long forgotten. Figures that might have been heroes or gods, or simply important people whose names and deeds had been lost to time's erosion. Exdeath's forces had occupied the ruins with typical disregard for their historical significance. Modern fortifications had been crudely installed among the ancient stones. Guards patrolled with weapons that seemed out of place against the elegant backdrop, and the barrier generator itself had been placed in what had once been a temple or throne room, its technological harshness violating the aesthetic that had been maintained for unknown centuries. The party fought their way through the occupation, battling corrupted soldiers and summoned monsters, navigating traps both ancient and modern. The ruins seemed to fight alongside them in some ways, ancient defensive systems activating in response to the corruption Exdeath had brought, as though the stones themselves rejected the dark sorcerer's presence. They reached the generator and destroyed it through a combination of magic and physical assault, watching as the device exploded in a shower of sparks and failed enchantments. 2 of the 4 generators were down now, theirs, and the one being targeted by another team. But word came through magical communication that the 3rd team had failed, overwhelmed by Exdeath's forces and destroyed before they could reach their target. The barrier would not fall unless all 4 generators were destroyed, which meant Zezat would have to destroy not just his assigned generator, but also the one the failed team had been targeting. It would require splitting his fleet, dividing his forces against 2 heavily defended positions, and the likelihood of success plummeted with each additional complication. Zezat apparently came to the same conclusion, but reached a different decision about how to proceed. Rather than splitting his fleet and weakening both assault teams, he concentrated all his forces against the 4th generator, the one the failed team had been attempting to reach. He destroyed it successfully, bringing down 3 of the 4 sub-barriers, but in doing so, he left his own target intact and his fleet exposed to concentrated counterattack from Exdeath's forces. The fleet was destroyed, ships sunk or captured, warriors killed or taken prisoner. Zezat himself fell in the battle, fighting to the last to ensure his people had time to escape, buying seconds and minutes with his life so that others might survive. When word of the disaster reached Galuf, the old warrior's grief was profound and terrible. Another Dawn warrior was gone, another friend lost to a war that seemed determined to claim everyone who opposed Exdeath's ambitions. But Zezat's sacrifice had not been meaningless. 3 generators were down, and the main barrier was weakened, flickering and unstable. It was still too strong to breach directly, but it was no longer impenetrable. If they could destroy the final generator, the western one that Zezat had been assigned to eliminate, the barrier would fall completely. The question was how to reach it, when Exdeath's forces now knew where the party was and would be prepared for their arrival. The answer came from an unexpected source. In the wreckage of Surget's fleet, scattered across the Western Sea, one ship remained functional though badly damaged. Sid and Mid, the engineer, and his grandson, who had pioneered crystal amplification technology in the First World, had somehow crossed dimensions and salvaged this vessel, were working to repair it and make it capable of flight. They sent word through magical channels that if the party could reach them and protect them while they completed the repairs, they could provide an airship that would allow direct assault on the final barrier generator. The party made their way to the Western Sea, traveling by any means available, requisitioning ships and mounts, pushing themselves to physical limits as they raced against time. They found Sid and Mid working with frantic energy on the salvaged ship, installing crystal engines salvaged from the wreckage of multiple vessels, reinforcing the hull with materials that should not work, but somehow did through clever engineering and desperate innovation. The repairs took 2 days. 2 days during which Exdeath moved against the water crystal in the kingdom of Waltz. Or rather, this world's version of Waltz, A kingdom with the same name but different history, different architecture, different people facing the same threat. Word came that the crystal had fallen despite the kingdom's best efforts to defend it. 2 crystals remained in the second world, 2 chances to prevent the catastrophe that would result from all 8 crystals being destroyed. When Sid and Mid finally completed their work, the result was something that barely qualified as airworthy. The ship was a patchwork of salvaged parts and improvised solutions, held together by engineering skill and what might have been prayer, its crystal engines pushing it to fly through methods that defied conventional understanding. But it flew, after a fashion, wobbling through the air like a drunk bird, but achieving altitude and responding to controls. They flew toward the Western Barrier generator, approaching from above where Exdeath's defenders had not anticipated assault. The generator was built into a fortress on the largest of the artificial islands, surrounded by smaller installations that served as support facilities and defensive positions. The party descended in the barely functional airship, crash landing more than landing properly, emerging from the wreckage with weapons drawn and determination overriding the pain of impact injuries. The battle for the final generator was desperate. Exdeath had reinforced this position after the other 3 generators fell, had concentrated his most powerful servants here, had installed additional defenses and failsafes designed to prevent exactly what the party was attempting. They fought through layers of guards and monsters, through magical traps and mechanical hazards, pushing deeper into the fortress with the single-minded focus of people who understood that failure here meant failure everywhere. At the generator's core, they encountered Gilgamesh, a warrior in service to Exdeath who wielded multiple weapons with a skill that seemed to defy physical limitations. He was pompous and theatrical, announcing his own greatness and the futility of opposing him. But beneath the bluster was genuine combat prowess. The battle was fierce, Gilgamesh demonstrating why Exdeath had trusted him with guarding this critical location, his multi-armed fighting style creating attacks from unexpected angles and forcing the party to defend against simultaneous threats. They defeated Gilgamesh, though not without cost, their own injuries and exhaustion mounting with each exchange. The warrior retreated, wounded but not broken, vowing that they would meet again, and that next time he would not underestimate them. The party destroyed the generator, watching as the device exploded and the last traces of the barrier protecting Exdeath's castle vanished. The path to confronting the Dark Sorcerer directly was now open, but before they could organize an assault on Exdeath's stronghold, word came of the 3rd crystal's destruction. The fire crystal, housed in a volcano fortress in the southern mountains, had fallen despite the defenders' preparations. Only 1 crystal remained in the second world, only 1 barrier between existence and the release of the void. The earth crystal, located in the great forest of Moor, where Exdeath himself had been born from corrupted wood, was the last hope. Galuf made the decision that would define what followed. He ordered the party to rest, to recover from their injuries, to prepare properly for what would be the final battle to protect a crystal. They had been running from crisis to crisis, fighting while exhausted, making mistakes born of fatigue and desperation. If they were going to Moor, if they were going to face Exdeath on ground he had chosen, they would do so at full strength or not at all. The brief respite gave them time to truly understand what they faced. 7 crystals had fallen across 2 worlds. The dimensional barrier between those worlds was failing, reality beginning to crack as the structure that held it together dissolved. Strange phenomena were occurring, places where the 2 worlds seemed to overlap, where geography from one dimension bled through into another, where people reported seeing ghostly images of locations that should not exist where they were being seen. The Moor Forest was ancient beyond reckoning, home to trees that had stood for millennia, their roots deep enough to touch the planet's molten core, and their branches high enough to touch the lower atmosphere. The forest was sacred to multiple cultures, considered a place where the boundary between physical and spiritual grew thin, where the rules that governed normal reality relaxed enough to permit glimpses of deeper truths. It was also the place where Exdeath had been born, when accumulated evil achieved critical mass and transformed a tree into a malevolent consciousness. The party approached more with caution, bordering on dread. The forest felt wrong from the moment they entered. The air thick with a presence that was not quite hostile but definitely unwelcoming. The trees seemed to watch them, their branches moving without wind, their shadows falling in patterns that suggested intentionality rather than random chance. Animals fled before their advance or hid in such perfect stillness that only Krile's beast speech could detect their presence. Deep in the forest, they found the guardian tree, the massive growth that served as both Moor's heart and its protector. The tree was dying, its bark cracked and weeping sap that looked disturbingly like blood, its leaves withered and falling in a constant rain of decay. This was what happened when a forest lost its guardian, when the living shield that protected it was corrupted and transformed into the very thing it was meant to defend against. Moor was dying because Exdeath had been born, and that birth had left a wound that had never healed. And there, standing before the earth crystal in a clearing at the forest's heart, was Exdeath himself. He greeted them with what might have been satisfaction, pleased that they had come, that the Dawn warrior's legacy and new champions had gathered to witness his final triumph. He did not intend to give them a serious battle, not while his true goal of destroying the crystal remained unachieved. He simply wanted them to watch, to understand the futility of their resistance, to comprehend that everything they had done had merely delayed the inevitable. Galuf charged forward, refusing to simply stand and watch, his rage and grief over Zizat's death driving him past caution and tactical sense. Exdeath engaged him almost dismissively at first, not treating the confrontation as a real threat. The others followed, supporting their companion's desperate assault, but Exdeath was too strong, too thoroughly in control of the situation. He wielded magic that should have been impossible, drawing power from the dying crystal, from the corrupted forest, from the dimensional instability itself. He struck them down again and again, each time giving them moments to recover, before attacking once more, toying with them, demonstrating the vast gap between their strength and his. The earth crystal shattered under Exdeath's final assault, and with its destruction came the event that 7 crystal destructions had been building toward. The two worlds began to merge, reality folding back on itself as the dimensional barrier collapsed completely. The sky above Moor flickered between 2 different versions, 2 sets of stars, 2 moons, images overlapping and separating in dizzying succession. The ground shook as continental plates from different dimensions tried to occupy the same space, mountains appearing and disappearing as geography from both worlds attempted to assert dominance. Exdeath stood at the center of this apocalyptic convergence, arms raised, drinking in the power flowing from the interdimensional rift that was opening above him. The void was waking, stirring from its millennium-long imprisonment, and Exdeath reached toward it like a prophet greeting his god. But before he could claim the power he sought, before he could merge with the void and achieve the ultimate control he had craved for 30 years, something unexpected happened. Galuf attacked again, and this time His assault carried behind it something beyond mere physical strength or magical power. This was desperation given form, the refusal to accept failure even when failure seemed absolute. He struck Exdeath with everything he had, not trying to kill the Dark Sorcerer, but trying to disrupt his connection to the Void, to break the flow of power before it could complete. The attack succeeded partially, knocking Exdeath backward, interrupting the ritual at a critical moment. Exdeath turned his full attention to Galuf, and the punishment he unleashed was terrible beyond description. Magic that should have killed instantly, spells that unmade flesh and bone, attacks that targeted not just the body, but the soul itself. Galuf endured, refused to fall, stood between Exdeath and the opening void through sheer force of will. His companions tried to reach him, tried to support him, but Exdeath had erected barriers that kept them away, that ensured Galuf faced the Dark Sorcerer alone. The beating continued until Galuf fell, his body broken beyond any healing magic's ability to repair, his life force fading with each labored breath. The barriers dropped, and the party rushed to him, Krile cradling her grandfather's head, healing magic flowing desperately from multiple sources, even though everyone present knew it was too late, that the damage was too severe, that they were watching someone die. Galuf spoke with his last strength, words meant to comfort, to inspire, to ensure his death was not meaningless. He had lived a full life, had seen his granddaughter grow, had fought alongside friends and made new ones in dimensions away from home. He had no regrets about how he had spent his years, and if his death here, holding the line against Exdeath for precious moments, contributed in any way to eventual victory, then it was a death well spent. He looked at Krile, told her he was proud of her, told her to be strong, to continue the fight, to remember that the Dawn Warriors had once saved the world, and that she carried their legacy within her. And then Galuf Baldesion, King of Baal, last of the Dawn Warriors, died in the forest where his greatest enemy had been born, having given everything to buy time for those who would continue fighting after he was gone. The death was not instantaneous loss of consciousness, followed by peaceful rest. It was a slow fading, awareness dimming moment by moment, the light leaving his eyes in stages that let everyone watch him slip away. Krile wept, 16 years old and watching the only family she had left die in her arms. The grandfather who had raised her and taught her and loved her despite the responsibilities of kingship that had demanded so much of his attention. The others stood silent witness, respecting the moment, understanding that grief required space to exist before action could continue. But then something happened that defied expectation and previous experience. The earth crystal shards, still glowing despite the destruction of the gem they had been part of, rose from where they had fallen and circled around Krile. The light they emitted grew brighter, not painful but overwhelming, and when it faded, Krile stood transformed. The crystal's power, the accumulated knowledge and strength it had granted to Galuf, had transferred to his granddaughter, recognizing her as his heir, not just in blood, but in purpose. Krile felt the abilities flowing into her, the job classes and skills that Galuf had mastered, the connection to the crystal's remaining essence. But more than mechanical power, she inherited something of his determination, his refusal to surrender in the face of impossible odds, his understanding that sometimes the best you could do was stand in the path of darkness and refuse to move until you were moved by force. She would carry his legacy forward, would become the Dawn Warrior of her generation, and Exdeath would learn that killing Galuf had not eliminated the threat he represented, but had instead created something more dangerous, a grieving granddaughter with power to match her determination for vengeance. Exdeath seemed unimpressed by this development. He had won. The crystals were destroyed. The worlds were merging. The void was waking. What did it matter if the girl had inherited her grandfather's power? She was still only one person, still finite and mortal, still ultimately helpless to prevent what was coming. He turned away from them, returning his attention to the void, resuming the ritual that would grant him dominion over annihilation itself. The party attacked again, with Krile now filling the role her grandfather had occupied, and this time their assault had more effect. Exdeath was distracted by the ritual, his attention divided between maintaining the connection to the void and defending himself from their attacks. They pressed their advantage, coordinating their strikes, using the job abilities from 8 destroyed crystals in combinations that created effects beyond the sum of their parts. They drove Exdeath back, away from the void's opening, disrupting the ritual once more. The dark sorcerer roared in frustration and teleported away, retreating to his castle to complete the merger without interruption. The party could not follow immediately, exhausted from the battle and still processing Galuf's death, but they knew where Exdeath was going and what he intended to do. The final confrontation was coming, and it would be fought in the dark sorcerer's stronghold on ground he had prepared, against an enemy who had 30 years to plan for this moment. They carried Galuf's body from the forest, returning to Castle Baal, where he was laid in state with honours befitting a king and a hero. The funeral was brief, necessity not allowing time for extended mourning, but it was sincere. Warriors who had served under Galuf, citizens who had been governed by him, and fellow rulers who had allied with him came to pay respects. They spoke of his courage, his leadership, his jokes that had lifted spirits even in darkest moments, and his ultimate sacrifice to give others a chance at victory. Krile stood through the ceremony with dry eyes, having wept herself empty in the moor forest, now hardened by grief into something sharp and focused. She was a princess no longer, but a warrior, carrying her grandfather's power and purpose, and she would see his mission completed or die in the attempt. The others stood with her, united by shared loss and shared determination, understanding that they fought now not just for abstract concepts like saving the world, but for Galuf's memory, for ensuring his death meant something. The preparation for the assault on Exdeath's castle took days. Time spent gathering supplies and weapons, coordinating with the kingdoms that remained, planning strategies for penetrating a fortress designed to be impregnable. Sid and Mid, working with engineers from multiple kingdoms, built a new airship, properly constructed this time rather than salvaged from wreckage, capable of transporting the party to the castle that floated in the space where the two worlds' geographies overlapped. But before the assault could begin, they received an unexpected message. A werewolf arrived at Castle Baal, one of Kelga's people from the kingdom of Quelb, bearing news from the fourth and final Dawn Warrior. Kelga had learned of Galuf's death and Exdeath's return, and he wanted to meet with the party before they assaulted the castle. He had information, he claimed, that might help them survive what was coming, knowledge that only he possessed about Exdeath's true nature and the weakness that might be exploited. They flew to Quelb, a kingdom built into mountain caves where Kelga's werewolf clan had made their home for centuries. The architecture was unlike anything in either world, carved directly from living stone, incorporating natural formations into designs that served both aesthetic and practical purposes. The werewolves greeted them with caution, their culture emphasizing pack loyalty and viewing outsiders with instinctive suspicion, but they allowed passage when Krile showed them proof of her connection to Galuf. Krile waited in the throne room, older now than when he had helped seal Exdeath 3 decades before. His fur silvered with age, but his eyes still sharp, and his movements still possessing lupine grace. He studied the party with an intensity that made Bartz uncomfortable, as though he could see through flesh to evaluate the soul beneath. After a long moment, he spoke, and his voice carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. Exdeath could not be killed through conventional means. They had learned this 30 years ago, when the Dawn warriors had defeated him in battle only to watch him reform from the scattered evil that composed his being. Physical destruction was temporary at best, and with the void awakening and granting him access to unprecedented power, even temporary destruction might now be impossible. But Krile had spent 3 decades researching the Dark Sorcerer's nature, studying ancient texts and consulting with scholars, seeking some weakness that might be exploited. He had found a possibility, not a guarantee, but a chance. Exdeath was not truly alive in the conventional sense, being an amalgamation of evil, spirits rather than a singular consciousness. This meant he had no true death to experience, but it also meant he had no true self to preserve. If the evil spirits that composed him could be separated, if the unified consciousness could be fractured back into its component parts, then Exdeath as an entity would cease to exist, even if the individual spirit survived. The legendary weapons, the 12 blades and staves and implements used to defeat Enuo 1,000 years ago, possessed the ability to damage fundamental existence in ways that conventional weapons could not. If those weapons could be recovered and wielded against Exdeath, they might be able to shatter the Dark Sorcerer's unified consciousness and end his threat permanently. The weapons had been sealed away when the world split, hidden in locations across both dimensions, their positions recorded in ancient tablets whose pieces were scattered between the worlds. Krile had spent years searching for these tablets, had recovered several fragments himself, and knew where others could be found. He gave this information freely, asking nothing in return, except that they succeed, where the Dawn warriors had failed, that they permanently end the threat Exdeath represented. And he gave them something else, something personal. He challenged Bartz to a duel, explaining that he wanted to test Dorgan's son, to see if the next generation possessed the strength their fathers had shown. The duel was not meant to injure or kill, but to evaluate. A ritual combat where Krile assessed Bartz's skill with weapons and tactics, his ability to adapt to unexpected situations, his mental resilience under pressure. Bartz fought as well as he could, drawing on everything his father had taught him and everything he had learned through the journey of the past weeks. He did not win, Kile's centuries of experience and supernatural abilities giving him advantages Bartz could not overcome, but he fought well enough that the old werewolf nodded with satisfaction. The old werewolf nodded with satisfaction, acknowledging that Dorgan's son was worthy of the legacy he carried. He gave Bartz his blessing, sharing with him insights into combat that only centuries of experience could provide, tactical wisdom that would prove valuable in the battles ahead. Then he dismissed them, sending them back to their preparations with the information about the legendary weapons and the understanding that this might be the last time they saw Quelb or its ruler alive. The hunt for the legendary weapons and ancient tablets became the party's focus for the next several days. They traveled between dimensions, the worlds merging, having created passages that allowed movement between what had once been separate realities. They explored ruins in the merged landscape, finding tablets that had been sealed in different locations when the worlds were split, but now existed in proximity to each other. their information fragmentary, but when combined, revealing the weapons' hiding places. The weapons were scattered across treacherous locations, hidden in dungeons and sealed vaults, protected by ancient guardians and modern monsters both. The party fought through challenges that tested every skill they had developed, every job class they had mastered, every combination of abilities the destroyed crystals had granted them. Each weapon they recovered added to their arsenal legendary blades and sacred staves, implements that hummed with power accumulated over centuries of mythic status. As they collected the weapons, they learned more about the original battle against Enuo, about the 12 warriors who had wielded these implements against the immortal sorcerer and the void he commanded. The warriors had not been unified in background or culture, had come from different nations and circumstances, had been brought together by necessity rather than natural affinity. In that sense, they resembled the current party, a collection of individuals who might never have met under normal circumstances, but who had been drawn together by crisis and had forged bonds through shared struggle. With the legendary weapons gathered and their preparations as complete as time allowed, the party turned their attention toward Exdeath's castle. The fortress floated in a space between dimensions, though true passage between worlds remained impossible. The dimensional barrier still holding despite its weakening. Strange phenomena occurred at the boundaries where the two realities pressed against each other. Ghostly overlaps and momentary glimpses of the other world's geography. But physical crossing would not be possible until something catastrophic occurred to shatter what remained of the barrier. The castle itself existed partially in both worlds simultaneously, its architecture impossible and its defenses formidable. The fortress was built from materials that should not exist, stone that shifted between states of matter, metal that bent light around itself, wood that seemed to grow and reshape itself, according to some alien logic. The new airship carried them toward the castle through skies that flickered with dimensional instability. Reality itself was breaking down as the void's influence spread, creating zones where physical laws became suggestions rather than rules, where up and down lost meaning, where time flowed at inconsistent rates. They navigated through these hazards through a combination of skill and luck, Sid and Mid's engineering keeping the ship functional when it should have torn itself apart under the stress of dimensional turbulence. They landed on a platform that extended from the castle's lower levels, a concession to conventional access that seemed out of place given the fortress's otherwise alien nature. The platform was guarded, but the guards were not human or even conventionally alive. These were animated suites of armor, golems constructed from materials harvested from both worlds, powered by magic that drew on the void itself. The party fought through them, learning that conventional tactics often failed against enemies whose existence defied normal biological constraints. Inside the castle, they found a structure that seemed designed to disorient and disturb. Corridors twisted back on themselves. Stairs led to destinations that should have been impossible given the geometry they passed through. Rooms existed in multiple states simultaneously with furniture and decorations that phased in and out of visibility. The castle was not merely defended, but was itself a weapon, designed to confuse and exhaust intruders, to make them question their own perceptions and doubt their ability to distinguish reality from illusion. They encountered Gilgamesh again, the multi-armed warrior who had guarded the final barrier generator. He was more serious this time, less prone to theatrical declarations, acknowledging that they had proven themselves capable opponents who deserved respect if not mercy. The battle was fierce, Gilgamesh wielding weapons recovered from across both worlds, each one a legendary blade or staff in its own right. his skill allowing him to use them all simultaneously in combinations that created openings where none should exist. The party defeated him again, though the victory cost them resources and energy they could ill afford to spend before confronting Exdeath. But Gilgamesh did something unexpected. Rather than retreating or dying, he acknowledged his defeat with something approaching grace. He had served Exdeath out of a combination of personal loyalty and belief that the Dark Sorcerer's power made victory inevitable. But watching these four warriors fight, watching them overcome obstacles that should have destroyed them, had planted doubt. Perhaps Exdeath was not invincible. Perhaps the void was not destiny. Perhaps even now resistance was not futile. Gilgamesh did not formally switch sides, did not pledge allegiance to the party's cause, but he stepped aside and allowed them passage without further conflict. It was a small gesture, almost meaningless in the scope of what they faced, but it represented something important. Even those who had served darkness could question, could doubt, could choose differently when faced with evidence that another path existed. The party thanked him and moved on, leaving the warrior to contemplate his choices in a castle that was rapidly becoming a tomb for all who remained within it. The climb through Exdeath's castle took hours, time measured in battles fought and corridors traversed, in puzzles solved and traps overcome. They faced demons that had been summoned from beyond reality, constructs built from the stuff of nightmares, and magical guardians whose existence violated natural law. Each victory brought them closer to the castle's peak, to the throne room where Exdeath waited, to the final confrontation that would determine whether two worlds survived or fell into the void's hungry embrace. At the throne room's entrance, they paused to prepare, to check equipment and restore their energy through magic and items, to steel themselves mentally for what awaited beyond the massive doors. Krile stood at the center of their formation, carrying her grandfather's legacy and the weight of expectation that came with it. Bartz stood beside her, the wanderer who had found purpose, carrying legendary weapons and his father's unfulfilled mission. Lenna and Faris flanked them, sisters reunited through crisis, representing kingdoms that had been torn apart by Exdeath's machinations and would either be restored or erased depending on the outcome of the next hour. They opened the doors and entered a throne room that defied description. The space was vast beyond what the castle's exterior suggested possible, stretching away in all directions farther than eyes could follow. The floor appeared to be transparent, revealing the void churning beneath it, darkness that contained not absence but active negation, nothingness that hungered to consume existence itself. Exdeath sat upon a throne carved from material that hurt to look at directly, his armored form radiating power that made the air shimmer and reality itself seem to bend around him. The Dark Sorcerer greeted them with what might have been satisfaction. They had come, as he knew they would, driven by determination and duty to face him, despite the futility of their resistance. He thanked them mockingly for delivering themselves to him, for gathering all the legendary weapons in one place where he could claim them once they fell, for providing entertainment in what would otherwise be a tedious wait for the void to complete its awakening. But beneath the mockery was something else, something that might have been respect or at least acknowledgement. They had fought well, had overcome obstacles that should have stopped them, had proven themselves worthy opponents even if they were ultimately outmatched. Exdeath rose from his throne, drew his own weapon, and invited them to show him the full extent of their strength before he sent them to join Galuf in death. The battle that followed was beyond anything they had experienced before. Exdeath wielded magic that should have been impossible, spells that reshaped reality around them, attacks that struck from multiple angles simultaneously, defensive techniques that turned their own power against them. He moved with speed that belied his armored bulk, his sword creating after-images that were themselves dangerous, his mastery of both physical combat and magical assault, making him nearly impossible to counter effectively. The party fought with everything they had, combining job abilities in ways they had never attempted before, pushing their skills and their bodies beyond safe limits, drawing on reserves of determination that went deeper than mere physical stamina. They wielded the legendary weapons with increasing proficiency, learning in the heat of combat how these implements were meant to be used, how their power could pierce through Exdeath's defenses and damage the fundamental structure of his existence. Slowly, impossibly, they began to prevail. Each strike with a legendary weapon tore at Exdeath's form, not merely damaging flesh and armor, but disrupting the evil spirits that comprised his being, forcing them apart, weakening the bonds that held them together as a unified consciousness. Exdeath's attacks became more desperate, more powerful, but also less controlled, the Dark Sorcerer recognizing that he was in genuine danger for the first time in decades. With a final coordinated assault, the party struck simultaneously from 4 angles, legendary weapons piercing through Exdeath's defenses and driving deep into his core. The Dark Sorcerer screamed, not in pain, but in fury and disbelief, unable to accept that mortals had overcome him, that the beings he had dismissed as insignificant had proven strong enough to threaten his very existence. His armored form began to crack, light pouring from the fissures, the evil spirits that composed him attempting to scatter and escape. But the legendary weapons held them, prevented their dispersal, forcing the spirits to remain together as the unity that had given them strength became the cage that ensured their destruction. Exdeath's physical form disintegrated, dissolving into light and shadow that spiraled upward toward the ceiling before dispersing into nothingness. For a moment, silence filled the throne room, broken only by the party's labored breathing and the distant sound of the void churning beneath them. They had won. Exdeath was destroyed, his consciousness shattered, his threat ended. The relief was profound and immediate, exhaustion and victory combining into an emotional release that left them weak-kneed and struggling to process what they had accomplished. They had succeeded where the Dawn Warriors had failed, had permanently eliminated, rather than merely sealed away the darkness that threatened both worlds. But victory proved temporary and incomplete. As Exdeath's essence dissipated, as the spirits that had composed him scattered beyond recovery, something went wrong. The void beneath the throne room began to surge, no longer held in check by Exdeath's controlling will, free to expand according to its own nature. The transparent floor cracked, darkness pouring through like water through a breaking dam, and from that darkness emerged something that had not existed moments before. The evil spirits that had been Exdeath, in their final moments before complete dispersal, had been drawn into the void, and the void, being nothingness given form, being active negation rather than passive absence, had absorbed those spirits and transformed them into something new. What emerged was Neo-Exdeath, a form that transcended the Dark Sorcerer's previous limitations, a being that existed as pure void given, shape by the malevolent consciousness it had consumed. Neo-Exdeath was not armored or humanoid. It was a fusion of organic and geometric forms, a structure that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, its appearance shifting depending on the angle from which it was viewed. The being radiated power, that made Exdeath's previous strength seem trivial by comparison, and its voice, when it spoke, was not one voice but many, the accumulated evil of centuries speaking in terrible harmony. The being declared that Exdeath's ambition to control the void had been flawed from conception. The void could not be controlled or directed because it was not a tool or a weapon, but a fundamental force, as intrinsic to existence as gravity or time. What Neo-Exdeath represented was not control of the void, but merger with it, consciousness given to annihilation, purpose applied to negation, and its purpose was simple and absolute. Everything would return to nothing. All that existed would be unmade. The universe itself would be reduced to the primal void from which it had originally emerged, and in that return to nothingness, all conflict and pain and struggle would finally end. The party had no time to recover from their battle with Exdeath, no opportunity to restore their strength or prepare for this new threat. They fought Neo-Exdeath with weapons already strained to their limits, with magic reserves nearly depleted, with bodies exhausted and minds pushed to breaking points. The being attacked from multiple directions simultaneously, its form shifting and dividing, creating distinct aspects that each wielded different elements and attack patterns. The battle was chaos, a desperate struggle for survival against an enemy that seemed designed to counter everything they attempted. Neo-Exdeath's power grew as the fight progressed, drawing energy from the void itself, becoming stronger while they grew weaker. It seemed impossible, seemed like a battle they could not win, and perhaps that assessment was accurate. Perhaps this was always meant to be a delaying action, holding the line just long enough for something or someone else to provide the solution they needed. That solution came from an unexpected source. The spirits of the Dawn Warriors appeared, translucent figures that materialized in the throne room despite being dead. Drawn by the crisis and by their connection to the crystals whose power still flowed through the party. Galuf stood among them, alongside Zezat, Dorgan, and Kelga, all of them present not in body but in will, in determination that death itself could not completely extinguish. They did not fight directly, being spirits rather than physical beings, but they lent their strength to the party, their presence reinforcing the legendary weapons, their experience guiding attacks and defenses, their accumulated wisdom providing insight into Neo-Exdeath's weaknesses. Dorgan stood beside Bartz, showing his son techniques he had never taught in life, passing on the final lessons of a Dawn Warrior to the son who had never known his father's true purpose. Galuf stood with Krile, offering encouragement and tactical advice, ensuring his granddaughter knew she carried not just his power, but his unshakable conviction that darkness could be overcome. With the Dawn Warriors' assistance, the tide of battle began to turn. The party struck with renewed strength, targeting the distinct aspects that composed Neo-Exdeath's form, destroying them one by one until only the core remained. That final assault was everything they had left, every remaining resource, every last reserve of strength and determination, poured into a coordinated strike that pierced through to Neo-Exdeath's essence and shattered it beyond recovery. The being dissolved, not into light or shadow, but into pure nothingness, the void reclaiming what had emerged from it. The throne room began to collapse, the castle's structure failing as the power that maintained it vanished. The party ran, the spirits of the Dawn Warriors fading as they expended their last energy ensuring the living could escape. Dorgan's final act being to clear a path for Bartz through falling debris, Galuf's final contribution being to hold a doorway open long enough for Krile to pass through. They reached the airship as the castle completed its disintegration. the entire structure falling into the void it had floated above, consumed by the darkness it had served. Sid and Mid, who had been maintaining the ship in preparation for the party's return, pulled them aboard and immediately launched, flying away from the collapsing castle at maximum speed. Behind them, the void began to seal itself, the rift between dimensions closing now that nothing remained to hold it open, reality reasserting its dominance over nothingness. The worlds, which had been merging during the crisis, began to separate once more. The process was not clean or immediate. Geography and populations tangled together in ways that would take years to fully sort out. But the fundamental split was occurring, two realities drawing apart into their distinct existences. The party watched from the airship as the sky above them flickered between two versions, as the ground below showed ghostly images of both worlds' landscapes overlapping, as reality slowly, painfully, restored the structure that had been shattered. When the separation completed, they found themselves in the first world, back in the dimension where their journey had begun. The sky was clear, clearer than it had been in weeks, the air fresh and the sun bright. Below them, they could see cities and towns, people emerging from shelters and hiding places, beginning the long process of rebuilding lives that had been disrupted by dimensional instability and apocalyptic crisis. The worlds had merged completely during the final battle, their geographies and populations intertwined in ways that would never fully separate again. What had been two distinct realities was now one world, a fusion that retained elements and memories of both original dimensions, but existed as a singular, unified reality. They landed in Tycoon, where King Alexander had recovered from his ordeal, though he would never be quite the same. The experience of possession and being used as a weapon, having left psychological scars that would require time to heal. Lenna and Faris reunited with their father in a scene that was simultaneously joyous and melancholic. Happiness at survival tempered by grief for what had been lost. The king acknowledged Faris as Sarisa, accepting that his eldest daughter had become someone different from the princess who had been lost but loving her regardless of the changes. Bartz found himself standing apart from the reunions, watching others celebrate survival while feeling strangely hollow. He had accomplished what he set out to do, had protected the world, had fulfilled his father's legacy, had proven himself worthy of Dorgan's training and sacrifice. But the cost had been steep, measured in lives lost and innocence destroyed, in the transformation from carefree wanderer to hardened warrior, in knowledge gained about darkness and evil that could never be unknown. Krile found him there, standing alone, and they talked about what came next. The crystals were gone, their power expended in the final battle, which meant the job system and the abilities they had relied upon were fading. They were becoming ordinary again, or as ordinary as people who had saved two worlds could ever be. Krile would return to Baal to rule in her grandfather's place, a responsibility she had never expected to bear so young, but which she would fulfill, because that was what Galuf would have wanted. Bartz faced a choice. He could return to wandering, could take Boko and resume the life he had lived before the wind crystal shattered, could honor his father's dying wish that he see the world and live free from duty and responsibility. Or he could do something else, could find a different purpose, could build a life that incorporated what he had learned and who he had become rather than trying to reclaim what he had been. He chose to wander, but with a difference. He would travel the merged world, exploring regions that had once belonged to separate dimensions but now existed side by side, seeing sites that combined elements from both original worlds in ways that created entirely new landscapes and possibilities. He would help where help was needed, but not bind himself to any particular place or cause. He would be a reminder that the crisis had been survived, a living symbol that ordinary people could become heroes when circumstances demanded it. Lenna chose to remain in Tycoon, to help her father rule and to work on restoring relationships with kingdoms that had been damaged during the crisis. She retained her love for animals and her gift for understanding them, and she used that gift to establish sanctuaries and protections for creatures that had been displaced or endangered by the dimensional instability. She would never forget what she had experienced, would carry the memory of battles fought and friends lost, but she would use those memories as motivation to build something better rather than as reasons to despair. Faris chose the sea, returning to the pirates who had raised them, but with a new mission. They would work to restore trade routes disrupted by the world's merging, to reconnect communities that had been separated by the fusion of two realities into one, to ensure that the cooperation and unity forged in battle could be maintained in peace. Sildra, the sea dragon, had survived the crisis, and together Captain and Dragon would sail waters that now combined oceans from both original worlds, becoming a legend in their own right. Stories told of the purple-haired pirate who helped those in need regardless of which original world they had come from. Sid and Mid returned to their engineering, but with a new focus. They would work to develop technologies that did not depend on crystal power, that could function sustainably without draining resources that could not be replaced. The guilt over their role in weakening the crystals drove them to ensure that future generations would not repeat the mistakes of the past, that progress and preservation could coexist rather than being opposed forces. In regions that had once been part of the Second World, in kingdoms they could now reach through the merged geography. Similar processes of rebuilding and reconciliation were occurring. Kelga returned to Quelb, his assessment of the new generation's worth confirmed by their victory, his hope for the future restored by evidence that even when the greatest warriors fell, others would rise to take their place. Zezat was mourned as a hero, his sacrifice remembered, his kingdom carrying forward under new leadership that honored his memory by prioritizing protection over expansion, community over conquest. The merged populations, people who found themselves living alongside those from what had been a parallel world, faced challenges of integration and adaptation. Communities formed that combined cultures and traditions from both original dimensions, creating something new from the fusion of what had been separate. It was not always smooth, not always peaceful, but it was happening. Evidence that even catastrophe could lead to unexpected unity if people chose cooperation over conflict. Years passed, then decades, measured in the slow turning of seasons rather than the frantic rush of crisis. The events that had nearly destroyed both worlds faded from immediate memory into history, from lived experience into stories told by those who had been there and then told again by those who had only heard the tales. The warriors of light, as they came to be called, lived their separate lives, occasionally crossing paths, always connected by the bonds forged in the fires of shared struggle. Bartz continued to wander, growing older but never quite settling, always finding another horizon to explore, another mystery to investigate, another person who needed help that only someone with his experience could provide. He carried the legendary weapons, distributed them to places where they could be protected, ensured that if they were ever needed again, they would be available. He visited Tycoon regularly, maintaining his friendship with Lenna and Faris, watching as they built lives that incorporated both their royal heritage and the experiences that had transformed them. He traveled throughout the merged world when he could, visiting Bal, where Krile ruled with a combination of her grandfather's wisdom and her own innovation, where the legacy of the Dawn Warriors was preserved not as a burden, but as an inspiration. He stood at Galuf's tomb and spoke to his friend, updating him on events, seeking advice from memory when decisions proved difficult, maintaining a connection that death had not completely severed. Sometimes, in quiet moments, Bartz would see his father's face in reflections or shadows, would feel Dorgan's presence as a comforting weight on his shoulder, would know with absolute certainty that the spirits of those who had died fighting for the world remained somehow connected to it, watching over those who continued the struggle they had begun. It was not a haunting, but a blessing, evidence that love and determination could transcend even death, that what had been fought for continued to matter beyond the lives of those who had done the fighting. The worlds healed, slowly but surely, the scars of the crisis fading though never completely disappearing. The merged geography created new landscapes where mountains from one world stood beside valleys from another, where coastlines that had never existed in either original dimension now defined new trade routes and settlements. People adapted to living in a world that was simultaneously familiar and strange, recognizing elements from their original home while discovering features that had belonged to the parallel reality they had never known existed. New generations grew up hearing stories of Exdeath and the Void, of crystals that powered the world until they shattered, of 4 heroes who had saved reality itself. Some believed these stories, some dismissed them as exaggerated myths, but all carried forward the lessons whether they acknowledged their source or not. The world was fragile, requiring protection. Power came with responsibility. Unity achieved more than division. Individual actions mattered, even when odds seemed overwhelming. In time, as those who had lived through the crisis passed away and their stories became legend, the exact details grew hazy. Arguments emerged about what had actually happened, about whether Bartz had truly been a wanderer or had secretly been a prince, about whether Faris had actually been Lenna's sister, or if that detail had been added later for dramatic effect, about whether Galuf had really sacrificed himself, or if he had simply died in battle like any other warrior. But certain elements remained consistent across all tellings. 4 people had stood against darkness when standing seemed futile. They had lost battles and won wars, had suffered defeats and achieved ultimate victory, had shown that ordinary people could become extraordinary when circumstances demanded it. The specifics might blur, but the core truth endured. Hope was not naive optimism, but determined action. Courage was not absence of fear, but refusal to let fear dictate choices. And heroism was not an inherent quality, but a decision made repeatedly in moments large and small. The crystals never reformed, their power expended completely in the battles that saved both worlds. Magic faded from common use, becoming increasingly rare, until it existed only in isolated pockets maintained by dedicated practitioners who kept the knowledge alive through careful teaching and practice. The world became more mundane, more ordinary, but also more stable. The wild fluctuations of crystalline power replaced by predictable natural law. Technology advanced to fill the void left by magic's departure. Innovations that drew on natural resources and human ingenuity rather than supernatural power. Some lamented this change, viewing it as a diminishment, a loss of wonder and possibility. Others embraced it, seeing in technological advancement the same human determination that had defeated Exdeath. The the same refusal to accept limitation, the same drive to shape the world according to human vision. Both perspectives held truth, but more importantly, both represented choices. The world had been saved so that people could make choices, could determine their own paths, could build or destroy according to their own will, rather than being forced into roles by external darkness. That freedom, that autonomy, was what the warriors of light had fought for, and its preservation justified every sacrifice made, every battle fought, every moment of pain endured. Bartz eventually settled, though he never quite stopped wandering in his heart. He built a small home near Tycoon, close enough to visit friends, but far enough to maintain the sense of independence that had always defined him. Boko grew old alongside him, the chocobo companion who had started everything, who had refused to abandon the quest when Bartz would have turned away. When Boko finally passed, Bartz wept as he had wept for Galuf, as he had wept for his father. Grief for the loss of a friend who had been constant through everything. He continued traveling even after settling. Shorter journeys now, trips measured in days rather than weeks, but still driven by the same curiosity that had led a young wanderer to investigate a meteor crash that had changed his life forever. He wrote down his experiences, creating a record of the crisis and its aftermath, ensuring that future generations would have access to accurate information, rather than relying solely on stories that grew more distorted with each retelling. When visitors came seeking him out, when young adventurers wanted to hear directly from one of the warriors of light, he welcomed them and shared what he knew. But he always emphasized that he was not special, not chosen by destiny, not marked from birth as a hero. He was simply someone who had been in the right place at the right time, who had made certain choices when other choices were available, who had continued fighting when surrender would have been easier. That message resonated with some and frustrated others who wanted their heroes to be exceptional, to be marked by fate as different from ordinary people. But Bartz held to it because he believed it mattered. If heroism required being special, then only special people could practice it, and the world would always be vulnerable to the next crisis. But if heroism was a choice available to anyone, if courage could be cultivated rather than inherited, then every person represented potential resistance to darkness. Every individual could contribute to preserving what mattered. Lenna and Faris both married, built families, raised children who carried forward their parents' values while forging their own paths. They taught their children about the crisis, about Exdeath and the void, but more importantly, they taught them about responsibility and compassion, about the importance of standing up for what was right even when doing so was difficult or dangerous. Their kingdoms prospered under leadership that remembered what had almost been lost and worked to ensure such catastrophe would never again threaten their world. Krile ruled Baal for decades, never marrying, dedicating herself fully to her kingdom and her grandfather's legacy. She remained connected to animals through her gift, using that connection to maintain relationships with creatures that might otherwise have been lost as magic faded. She opened Baal's borders to refugees from both worlds, creating a kingdom that celebrated diversity and honored difference, proving that unity did not require uniformity. She remained in contact with the others throughout her life, visiting when possible, maintaining through letter and message the friendships that had been forged in fire and tempered through shared loss. When she died, elderly and accomplished, her funeral was attended by people from both worlds, by humans and werewolves and creatures that had no name in common language, all of them there to honor someone who had carried forward her grandfather's mission and made it her own. The world continued turning, as worlds do, indifferent to individual lives and stories, even while being shaped by the accumulated weight of millions of individual choices. The crisis that had nearly ended everything became a distant event, studied by scholars, commemorated by monuments, remembered in ceremonies, but no longer felt as immediate reality by populations several generations removed from the events. But the effects persisted, subtle and pervasive, woven into the fabric of both worlds in ways that could not be easily separated from the broader flow of history. The passages between dimensions remained, allowing trade and communication that enriched both worlds. The mixed communities that formed when populations were trapped in the wrong world during the merge evolved unique cultures that combined elements from both sources into something new and vibrant. The understanding that the world had nearly ended, that existence itself had hung in the balance and been saved only through the courage and sacrifice of a few individuals, shaped philosophical and theological thinking for generations. Questions about the nature of heroism, about individual responsibility in the face of systemic evil, about whether hope was rational or merely necessary, these became central to how people understood their place in the universe. And occasionally, in times of particular stress or danger, when darkness seemed ascendant and the struggle appeared futile, someone would remember the story of the warriors of light. They would remember that 4 ordinary people, none of them chosen by prophecy or marked by destiny, had stood against annihilation and prevailed. They would remember that courage was a choice, that determination could overcome seemingly impossible odds, that individual actions mattered even when the scale of challenge suggested otherwise. In those moments of remembering, people found strength to continue their own struggles, inspiration to face their own darkness, permission to believe that their actions could make a difference even when logic suggested futility. That was the true legacy of the warriors of light, not the specific battles they won or the particular evil they defeated, but the proof they provided that ordinary people could become extraordinary when circumstances demanded it, that the choice to stand and fight mattered regardless of outcome, that hope was not naive optimism, but determined action in the face of darkness. The story of Final Fantasy V is ultimately a story about that choice, about the decision to fight rather than surrender, to hope rather than despair, to act rather than accept. It does not promise that choosing heroism guarantees victory, does not suggest that determination alone can overcome any obstacle, does not offer false comfort about the price of resistance. It simply shows people making those choices, facing the consequences, and through persistence and sacrifice and mutual support, achieving what seemed impossible. Bartz, Lenna, Faris, and Krile were not special. They were not chosen by destiny or marked by prophecy. They were simply people who, when confronted with the end of everything, chose to fight back. They lost friends, suffered defeats, watched the world nearly end despite their best efforts, but they continued fighting. And in the end, that was enough. Not because they were heroes, but because they chose to act heroically. Not because they were destined to save the world, but because they decided to try. That is the message that resonates across the decades since the game's release, the truth that makes the story worth remembering and retelling. We are all ordinary until we choose otherwise, all powerless until we decide to act, all insignificant until we determine that significance is not given, but created through the choices we make and the stands we take. The Warriors of Light saved 2 worlds, not because they were special, but because they were willing. And that willingness, that simple decision to try despite impossible odds, is what transforms ordinary into extraordinary. The ending shows them going their separate ways, living separate lives, connected by shared experience but not bound by it. There is no promise of continued adventure, no suggestion that they will ride off into further crises. They simply return to the world they saved and build lives within it, ordinary lives marked by the extraordinary experiences they carry, but not defined by them. It is a quiet ending, some might say anticlimactic, but it is honest in a way that many fantasy narratives are not. It acknowledges that life continues after the grand adventure ends, that saving the world does not exempt you from the smaller struggles of daily existence, that heroism is not a permanent state, but a series of choices made moment by moment throughout a life. The warriors of light do not become kings and queens who rule happily ever after, though some inherit kingdoms. They become people who continue living, who carry their scars and memories, who remember both what they accomplished and what it cost, and who find meaning in the continuation itself. And that, perhaps, is the most subversive and important element of Final Fantasy V's narrative. It refuses to make heroism easy or consequence-free, refuses to promise that doing the right thing will always lead to happy endings, refuses to pretend that saving the world solves all problems or erases all pain. Instead, it shows heroism as difficult, costly, and necessary, as something worth doing precisely because it is hard rather than despite that difficulty. The world they save is not perfect. It is merely saved, given another chance to continue existing, to grapple with its problems, to build and fail and rebuild in the messy process of ongoing life. The warriors of light do not fix everything, do not create utopia, do not ensure perpetual peace and prosperity. They simply prevent annihilation, preserve the possibility of futures both good and bad, ensure that the world continues to exist so that the people within it can determine through their own choices what that existence means. That is victory enough, the game suggests. Not the perfect world of fantasy, but the imperfect world of reality, still struggling, still striving, still here. And if you like what you've heard, if this story of crystals and warriors and world-spanning adventure has resonated with you, consider leaving a like and a comment below. Share your own thoughts about Final Fantasy V, about the themes it explores, about what the story means to you. And if you want to see more deep dives into forgotten corners of gaming lore, consider subscribing. The journey through these worlds continues, one story at a time, and there are always more horizons to explore. The tale of Bartz, Lenna, Faris, and Krile ends not with a period, but with an ellipsis, suggesting that though this particular story has concluded, the lives it depicts continue beyond our observation. They saved the world, and then they lived in it, and that living was itself a continuation of the fight they began. The determination to make the sacrifice worthwhile by building something worth having sacrificed for. Their legacy is not the specific battles they won, but the example they set, the proof that when darkness rises and the end seems certain, the choice to stand and fight matters, not because victory is guaranteed, but because the attempt itself has value, because resistance itself means something, because the decision to try is itself a form of triumph over the darkness that insists all effort is meaningless. That is the complete story of Final Fantasy V, a tale of broken crystals and restored worlds, of ordinary people becoming heroes, of legacy inherited and fulfilled, of sacrifice and survival, and the stubborn insistence that hope is possible even when all evidence suggests otherwise. It is a story worth remembering, worth retelling, worth carrying forward into our own struggles against our own darkness, a reminder that we are all capable of more than we believe, that courage is a choice available to everyone, and that sometimes the simple act of refusing to surrender is itself enough to change the world.